There is a moment, somewhere in the summer of 1940, when the fate of the free world hangs not on armies or navies or the decisions of generals in fortified rooms, but on a handful of exhausted young men climbing into cockpits they might never climb out of, above a small island that refuses to fall. That moment stretches across months. It plays out in the skies above the English Channel, above the chalk cliffs of Kent and the fields of Sussex, above the burning streets of London. It is not a single battle in the traditional sense. It has no front line you can draw on a map, no territory exchanged, no river crossed or hill taken. It is something stranger and more desperate than that. It is a fight for the sky itself and the right to exist beneath it. This is the Battle of Britain. Before we go any further, if you are new here and you find yourself drawn to stories told slowly, thoroughly, and with the care that history deserves, then take a moment now and subscribe. These documentaries take time to research and to build, and every person who joins this community makes the next one possible. Whether you are settling in for the night, winding down after a long day, or simply looking for something that rewards your attention rather than demanding it, you are in exactly the right place. Get comfortable. This one is going to take a while, and it is worth every minute. Now, close your eyes for a moment, or don't, and imagine the summer of 1940 as it actually was. Not as it appears in faded photographs or neat historical summaries, not as a chapter in a textbook bracketed by dates and outcomes. Imagine it as the people living through it experienced it, as a world that had, in the space of a few catastrophic weeks, become almost unrecognizable. Just months before, France had seemed impregnable. The French army was considered among the finest in Europe. The Maginot Line, that vast, expensive architecture of concrete and steel, was supposed to make invasion from the east a fantasy. Britain and France together represented the combined weight of two empires, two proud military traditions, two nations that had survived the last World War and rebuilt themselves from its wreckage. And then, in a matter of weeks, it was gone. The German war machine, fast, coordinated, and utterly unlike anything the Allied commanders had prepared to face, swept through the Ardennes, outflanked the defences, and carved France apart with a violence and speed that left the entire Western Alliance reeling. The evacuation at Dunkirk rescued more than 300,000 men from the beaches, which was itself a kind of miracle. But make no mistake about what Dunkirk was. It was a rescue from catastrophe. The equipment was left behind, the positions were lost, and France, on the 22nd of June 1940, signed an armistice and fell silent. Hitler stood on the continent of Europe, unopposed. No nation within reach of his armies remained free. To the north, Scandinavia had fallen. To the west, France was occupied. To the east, Poland had been erased from the map. The countries of neutral Europe held their breath and calculated their chances, and across the water, barely 35 kilometers from the French coast, at its narrowest crossing, one nation remained: Britain. And here is the thing you must understand, the thing that gives this story its particular, almost unbearable weight. Britain was not in a strong position. The army that had been rescued from Dunkirk was exhausted and under-equipped. The navy was formidable, but could not be everywhere at once. The civilian population had lived through one catastrophic world war within living memory, and now they were being asked to absorb the reality that they might be next. Some voices, serious voices, voices inside the government itself, suggested that negotiation might be the wiser path, that a deal might be struck, that survival, even under compromise, was preferable to annihilation. Winston Churchill, who had become Prime Minister only weeks before, answered those voices plainly. There would be no negotiation. There would be no deal. Britain would fight. But fighting required more than resolve. It required an actual, functional ability to stop what was coming. And what was coming was the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, arguably the most battle-hardened, experienced, and numerically powerful air force on Earth in the summer of 1940. It had cut its teeth in the Spanish Civil War. It had dominated the skies over Poland. It had swept the French Air Force from the air with brutal efficiency. Against this, Britain had the Royal Air Force. The RAF was not small. It was not incompetent. It possessed machines that were, in certain hands, the equal of anything the Germans could put in the air. But it was outnumbered. It was tired. And it was about to face a sustained campaign of destruction designed specifically to eliminate it from the sky, permanently. And if the RAF fell, the invasion would follow. Operation Sea Lion, the German plan for crossing the Channel and seizing Britain, was already drawn up and waiting. The barges were being assembled in French and Belgian ports. The maps were printed. The orders were written. All that stood between those plans and their execution was air superiority over the English Channel and southern England. All that stood between those plans and Britain was, essentially, a few thousand pilots and the machines they flew. What follows is the complete history of how that fight was won. Not easily, not cleanly, not without cost that is almost impossible to fully comprehend even now, decades later, with the distance of history between us and those burning summer skies. But won. We are going to trace every phase of this battle from its origins in the collapse of France, through the first probing skirmishes above the Channel, through the savage intensity of Eagle Day and the weeks that followed, through the moment when the RAF came so close to breaking that senior commanders privately wondered if it could survive another week, and then through the strange, fateful era that changed everything and gave Britain just enough time to hold on. We will meet the machines, the Spitfire, the Hurricane, the Messerschmitt. We will understand the technology that tilted the odds in ways the Germans never fully grasped until it was too late. We will follow the decisions made in the upper reaches of both commands, the confident miscalculations on one side, the quiet, methodical determination on the other. And we will spend time with the people who lived it, the pilots who flew until they could barely lift their arms, the civilians who slept in tube stations and woke up to find their streets had changed shape overnight, the women who built the aircraft, plotted the incoming raids, and kept the information flowing that made the whole fragile system work. This is not a simple story of heroes and villains, though there is heroism here in quantities that are genuinely staggering. It is a story about what happens when a nation is pushed to the absolute limit of what it can endure, and what that limit turns out to be. So settle in. The summer of 1940 is waiting for you. And the sky above southern England is about to fill with sound. In the spring of 1940, the world watched in stunned silence as the most powerful army Europe had ever seen moved with a speed and ferocity that no general staff had fully anticipated. Decades of military doctrine, of carefully drawn defensive lines and measured advances, collapsed within days. The German war machine did not simply win battles, it made the very concept of traditional warfare feel obsolete overnight. Entire divisions that had prepared for the grinding attritional horror of the last Great War found themselves surrounded, cut off, and overwhelmed before they could properly orient themselves to the new reality bearing down upon them. The shock was not merely tactical, it was psychological. Armies trained to hold ground found there was no ground left to hold. Nations that had survived centuries of conflict found themselves reaching for the telephone to discuss the terms of their surrender. The strategy the Germans employed had a name that would echo through military history for generations. Blitzkrieg, lightning war, was not simply speed for the sake of speed. It was a philosophy of violence made coherent. Strike the enemy at his most vulnerable point, bypass his strength entirely, and drive so deep into his rear that his frontline forces become irrelevant before a single volley is exchanged. Armored columns moved through terrain that defending commanders had considered impassable, rendering their careful defensive arrangements meaningless. Aircraft screamed down ahead of the tanks, destroying communications, shattering supply lines, and turning the enemy's ability to think and respond into rubble. What the German military had understood, and what their opponents had not yet grasped, was that modern war was won not by killing soldiers, but by killing the will to organize resistance. And in the spring and early summer of 1940, they were extraordinarily good at it. Denmark fell in a single day. Norway was more contested, the fighting lasting weeks in the cold fjords and mountain passes. But the outcome was never genuinely in doubt. The British attempted to intervene, and found themselves unable to sustain operations against German air power on land they did not control. They withdrew. The lesson was brutal and clear. Without mastery of the air above a battlefield, no army on the ground could hold for long. It was a lesson that would echo forward into every chapter of the war that followed, and it was a lesson the men planning Britain's defence were watching very carefully, in fact. Then came the blow that shattered everything. In the second week of May 1940, German forces crossed into France, Belgium, and the Netherlands with a force of roughly 135 divisions. The Netherlands held for 5 days before capitulating. Belgium fought longer, but could not hold. The British and French high commands had anticipated a German thrust through Belgium. What they had not anticipated, what proved to be among the greatest strategic surprises of the entire war, was the armoured columns pouring through the Ardennes forest to the south, a route that Allied planners had dismissed as impractical for large mechanized formations. It was not impractical, it was decisive. Within days, the leading German armoured units had reached the English Channel, slicing cleanly through the Allied rear, and trapping the British Expeditionary Force and a substantial portion of the French army against the coast. The beaches of Dunkirk became the defining image of that catastrophe. More than 300,000 British and Allied soldiers were lifted from the sand and surf by a fleet of naval vessels and civilian boats, in an evacuation that was called, by some in the press, a miracle. And in a narrow sense it was. The survival of that many trained men carried enormous strategic value, but it required a ruthless clarity to look past the headlines and understand what had actually happened. The British Army had escaped, but it had left behind nearly all of its heavy equipment, its tanks, its artillery, its vehicles, its supplies. The men were saved. The army, as a fighting force capable of returning to the continent in any near-term sense, was not. Britain had pulled its soldiers from the fire, but the fire was still burning, and it was burning on the wrong side of the Channel. France fought on through June, but the outcome had the quality of a formality. German columns swept south and west. The French government abandoned Paris and declared it an open city to spare it from destruction. One of the great capitals of Western civilization was entered by German troops on the 14th of June 1940, soldiers marching beneath the Arc de Triomphe in a procession designed as much for the newsreel cameras as for any military purpose. The imagery was deliberate. Germany wanted the world to see this, wanted enemies to feel the weight of it. The French government, retreating south, fractured under the pressure and collapsed into competing visions of what surrender might look like and what it might cost. On the 22nd of June, in a railway carriage at Compiègne, the same carriage in which Germany had signed the armistice of 1918, France signed a document ending its resistance. Hitler had chosen that location personally. The symbolism was not subtle. Adolf Hitler stood at that moment on a plateau of military success that history offered no real comparison for. In less than 8 months of active campaigning, Germany had conquered or neutralized Poland, Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, and France. The continent of Europe, from the Atlantic coastline to the edges of the undefeated Soviet Union in the east, lay either under direct German occupation or in the hands of governments too intimidated or too ideologically aligned to offer meaningful resistance. Spain stayed neutral but friendly. Italy had entered the war on Germany's side. The Soviet Union was, for the moment, bound by a non-aggression pact. The United States was still watching from across the Atlantic, its public deeply reluctant to enter another European war. There was, at that precise moment, no coalition forming to oppose Germany, no second front waiting to open, no liberating force assembling in any harbour that might threaten what Germany had built. And yet one obstacle remained. 21 miles of grey water, in some places less, separated mainland Europe from an island that had not been successfully invaded since the 11th century. Britain still stood. Its government, under a prime minister who had taken office only weeks earlier, had made clear that it had no intention of negotiating from a position of defeat. Winston Churchill had addressed Parliament in the days following Dunkirk, and had done so without illusion, without false comfort, and without any suggestion that he was prepared to discuss terms. The words he used were heard across the world on the wireless. A country prepared to fight on its beaches, on its landing grounds, in its fields, streets, and hills, and never to surrender. They were words spoken into a moment of genuine crisis, and they were meant, fully, unambiguously meant. Hitler was not initially certain what to do with Britain. His ideological view of the English-speaking peoples was complex and at times almost admiring, and there is evidence from that period that some part of him hoped a negotiated peace might still be achievable, a peace in which Britain accepted German dominance of the continent and was allowed to retain its empire. He waited. He watched. He made gestures through intermediaries. The British government ignored them. Days passed, and then weeks, and gradually it became apparent that no accommodation was coming. Churchill's government was not going to bend. The island was not going to yield. And so the question became not whether to bring Britain to its knees, but how. The German military considered the problem with the same methodical confidence that had served it so well everywhere else. An amphibious invasion was theoretically possible, Operation Sea Lion, as the planning was designated, but its requirements were demanding. The German Navy was not, by any honest assessment, a match for the Royal Navy. Britain's surface fleet was powerful, experienced, and positioned to devastate any invasion convoy crossing the Channel. The only way an amphibious assault could work, the planners concluded, was if German air power could neutralize the naval threat. And the only way German air power could do that was if the Royal Air Force no longer existed as an effective fighting force. Everything, then, came down to the air. The Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, which had performed with devastating effectiveness across every campaign it had fought, would need to destroy the RAF. And it would need to do it quickly, before the autumn weather closed the channel to invasion shipping, and before Britain could use the time to strengthen what it already possessed. What the German planners did not fully appreciate in those early summer weeks of 1940 was how much Britain already possessed. They had watched the fall of France and drawn certain conclusions. They had seen the RAF unable to hold the skies over the continent. They had measured what they knew of British aircraft production and pilot numbers against their own and found the comparison favourable. They had assessed British radar capabilities and found their intelligence incomplete. They had spoken with their own commanders, who were flush with success and inclined to confidence. Every calculation pointed in the same direction. Britain could be broken. The RAF could be destroyed in a matter of weeks. And then the Channel, that narrow strip of grey water, would be crossed. What none of those calculations fully accounted for was the particular quality of the organisation waiting for them on the other side. A defence that was quieter than German confidence, older than German arrogance, and more carefully prepared than anyone in Berlin had thought to ask. The summer of 1940 had a stillness to it that those who lived through it would remember for the rest of their lives. A terrible, waiting quality. Europe had fallen. The continent was silent under occupation, and across the water, an island nation sharpened what it had, organized what it could, and prepared to face something it had never faced before. France had fallen. In the summer of 1940, the swastika flew above Paris, above Brussels, above Amsterdam and Copenhagen and Oslo. Nation after nation had buckled beneath the weight of a German military machine that seemed to defy every conventional understanding of war. The Blitzkrieg had not merely defeated armies, it had outthought them, outpaced them, left entire general staffs staring at maps that no longer reflected reality. And now, on the western edge of the European continent, the sea began, just 33 kilometers of water at its narrowest point, a strip of grey-green channel that separated the Third Reich from the last major power still standing against it. Hitler looked across that water and understood that the war was not yet won. Britain remained, and Britain, unlike France, had not asked for terms. In the immediate aftermath of France's fall, there was within the German High Command a genuine belief that Britain would negotiate. The logic seemed sound to men who had watched country after country collapse. Why would an island nation, stripped of its continental allies, stripped of the army it had only barely evacuated from the beaches of Dunkirk, choose to continue a fight that appeared so obviously lost? Hitler himself held this view with some conviction. He made gestures, public and private, that suggested room for a settlement. He had what he wanted, the European continent under German authority, and the British Empire, if it chose cooperation over resistance, might survive relatively intact. But Winston Churchill's government refused. The doors were shut, the speeches were made, and Britain made clear, in words that echoed across the world, that it intended to fight. The refusal transformed Hitler's strategic position from one of triumph into one of an unwanted problem. He had not planned, in any serious detail, for a war against Britain from the sea. His military genius, if it could be called that, was continental. Armour racing across plains, infantry flooding through gaps in enemy lines, aircraft screaming low over retreating columns. The English Channel was not a plain. It could not be bypassed, could not be outflanked. It had to be crossed. And crossing it under fire, against a defended coastline, with an army that had no tradition of amphibious warfare, and a navy that was, by any honest measure, far inferior to the Royal Navy, this was a problem of an entirely different kind. In mid-July of 1940, Hitler issued a directive. The directive had a name, Operation Sea Lion. What Sea Lion demanded was staggering in its scope. The German army would need to land several divisions across a broad front of southern England coastline, establishing a beachhead large enough to resist immediate British counterattack, and then push inland to encircle London. The German Navy was required to assemble the transport fleet, barges, riverboats, steamers, whatever vessels could be gathered from the waterways and harbours of occupied Europe, and shepherd these troops across the Channel, while the Royal Navy tried to destroy them. The German army's planners, accustomed to land warfare, initially proposed landings across a frontage stretching from roughly the Thames estuary westward past the Isle of Wight, a span of nearly 250 kilometres. The Navy looked at those proposals and recoiled. Protecting a fleet of slow, ungainly river barges across that kind of frontage, against a navy as powerful as Britain's, was not an operational plan, it was a maritime catastrophe waiting to happen. The tension between the army and navy over Sea Lion's design was never fully resolved. The army wanted breadth, multiple landing points to divide British defences and prevent concentrated counterattack. The Navy wanted concentration, a narrow crossing corridor they had some hope of defending with mines and aircraft and whatever surface vessels they possessed. The compromise that emerged satisfied neither service completely. The barge fleet grew as thousands of vessels were requisitioned from the Rhine and from Belgian and Dutch waterways, pulled from their peaceful commercial duties and converted, roughly and not very convincingly, into military transports. By late summer, intelligence reports reaching British planners showed hundreds of these vessels massing in the Channel ports of France and the Low Countries: Calais, Boulogne, Ostend, Antwerp. The invasion machinery was assembling, but it had a single, absolute prerequisite. The prerequisite was air superiority. The German High Command understood this with complete clarity. Without control of the skies above the Channel and the invasion beaches, the transport fleet would be annihilated. The Royal Navy's warships, already positioned and ready, would tear through a convoy of river barges in open water with devastating efficiency if those barges had no air cover and the British ships faced no aerial threat. The Luftwaffe, therefore, was not simply a supporting arm of Operation Sea Lion, it was the essential first condition. Until the Royal Air Force was destroyed, or at minimum rendered incapable of effective interference, no ship could sail. The entire weight of German strategic planning in the summer of 1940 rested on that single requirement: defeat the RAF. Everything else followed from it, or nothing followed at all. Into this requirement stepped Hermann Göring, the commander of the Luftwaffe, with a confidence that bordered on contempt for the problem before him. Göring was a man of enormous ego and considerable early talent, a celebrated fighter pilot from the First Great War who had built the Luftwaffe from nothing into what was genuinely the most battle-tested air force in the world. His aircraft had been forged in combat, in Spain, in Poland, in France, in the Low Countries. His pilots were experienced, his bombers proven, his fighter arm equipped with the formidable Messerschmitt. He told Hitler that the RAF could be broken. He made this promise with the casual surety of a man who had never yet been seriously wrong about air power. The Luftwaffe would sweep the skies clean. It would take weeks, not months. The army could then cross in safety. Sea Lion would proceed. What Göring did not do, what German intelligence consistently failed to do, was build an accurate picture of what the RAF actually was. German assessments of British air power were riddled with errors of both fact and assumption. They underestimated the number of aircraft Britain was producing. They underestimated the depth of the RAF's organisational structure, its ground control system, its ability to direct fighters with precision rather than simply sending them up to search the sky. They misread the radar network along the British coast, those tall metal towers that the Luftwaffe's reconnaissance pilots had photographed repeatedly, understood in general terms to be some kind of detection system, but not fully grasped as the integrated, nationwide early warning architecture that it truly was. German planners assumed that what they could see was most of what there was. They were wrong in ways that would prove expensive. There was also an assumption, deeply embedded in German thinking, about British will. The logic of conquest had taught German commanders that military defeat produces political collapse, that once an enemy's armed forces are broken, the government sues for peace and the war ends. This had been true in Poland. It had been true in France. It had been true in country after country across the continent. Britain, in this thinking, would behave the same way. Destroy the RAF, and the British government would recognize the hopelessness of its position and negotiate. The British people would not endure the horror of bombing indefinitely. Their resolve would crack. The German military did not seriously entertain the possibility that it would not. This failure of imagination, this inability to account for a nation that simply refused to follow the expected pattern, was perhaps the most consequential error of the entire campaign. Through the weeks of June and July, as the barge fleet grew in the Channel ports, and the Luftwaffe moved its aircraft forward to airfields in France, Belgium, and Norway, the shape of the coming battle became clear. Germany was preparing to launch the largest sustained air campaign in the history of warfare up to that point. Thousands of aircraft, thousands of experienced aircrew, a logistical apparatus of tremendous power, all of it aimed at a single objective, the destruction of fighter command. The men in the German operations rooms drew lines on maps. Target lists were compiled. Radar stations, airfields, aircraft factories, port facilities, all marked for destruction in a sequence of overwhelming blows. It looked, on paper, like a plan that could work. But plans drawn in operations rooms do not account for the men who will oppose them. They do not account for the scientist who had spent years perfecting a detection technology his enemies barely understood. They do not account for the quiet commander who had spent months building a defensive system of extraordinary sophistication. They do not account for the young pilots, English, Scottish, Welsh, and soon pilots from Poland, Czechoslovakia, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, who were already in their cockpits, already flying patrols, already learning the sky above the Channel and the fields of Kent and Sussex. Sea Lion was a plan, but on the other side of that narrow strip of water, something was waiting for it. Something Germany had not yet learned to respect. The German directive set a target date. The invasion, if conditions were met, was to be ready for mid-September. That gave the Luftwaffe roughly 6 to 8 weeks to accomplish what Goering had promised. 6 to 8 weeks to destroy an air force that had never been beaten, defending a country that had not been invaded in nearly 900 years. The barge captains waited in the harbours. The army divisions stood ready in their French billets. The invasion of Britain was, as of that summer, not merely a plan, it was a schedule, and whether that schedule would hold depended entirely on what happened next in the skies above England. While the last embers of French resistance were dying across the Channel, a quiet man sat at a desk in Middlesex and began to build a wall, not of stone or steel, but of radar masts, telephone cables, sector stations, and the sheer disciplined thinking of a mind that refused to panic. Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding had been preparing for this moment for years. He had argued for modern fighters when others were still debating biplanes. He had fought Treasury officials and Air Ministry committees with the same stubborn patience he would later apply to the Luftwaffe. He was not a man who inspired cheering crowds or roused rooms to their feet. He was something rarer and, as events would prove, far more valuable. A man who was simply, relentlessly right. Dowding's manner earned him a nickname among his peers, Stuffy. It was not meant as a compliment. Where other commanders glad-handed, he calculated, Where others spoke in soaring declarations, he wrote careful memoranda and kept meticulous records. He had clashed with the Air Ministry repeatedly over the preceding years, insisting that fighter command be kept at home, while others urged that more squadrons be fed into the collapsing battle in France. He resisted. He argued that stripping Britain's air defences to shore up a losing campaign would leave the island itself exposed, and he put that argument in writing with a directness that made his superiors uncomfortable. History would vindicate every word. The pilots and aircraft he preserved in those arguments were the very ones that would now stand between Britain and occupation. The force Dowding commanded was not large by the standards of the conflict gathering against it. Fighter command numbered fewer than 700 operational aircraft at the opening of the summer, spread across groups covering different regions of the country. At its heart were two machines that would become among the most recognized aircraft in history. The Hawker Hurricane was older in design, more robust in construction, and capable of absorbing punishment that might tear apart a more delicate frame. It was not the faster of the two British fighters, but it was steady, forgiving to pilots who were still learning their trade, and devastatingly effective against the German bombers it would most often be directed to engage. The Hurricane bore the weight of the battle in ways that later legend sometimes obscured. Then there was the Supermarine Spitfire, a machine that seemed to belong to a different category of aircraft altogether. Where the Hurricane was a fighter built for war, the Spitfire looked almost too elegant for it. Its elliptical wings a signature visible even from the ground, its lines drawing from the aerodynamic instincts of designer Reginald Mitchell, who had not lived to see what his creation would mean to the world. The Spitfire was fast, nimble, and capable of climbing with an urgency that left observers breathless. Pilots who flew it described something beyond mechanical operation, a responsiveness that made the aircraft feel less like a machine and more like an extension of the body. It was not perfect, nothing was, but it was a match for anything the Luftwaffe would send across the water. Together, Hurricane and Spitfire gave Dowding the instruments of resistance. But instruments are useless without a system to direct them, and here was where Britain's true advantage lay, one so significant and so carefully guarded that Germany would not fully appreciate it until the battle was already decided. Along the eastern and southern coasts of England, a chain of tall steel structures stood against the sky. Some reached more than 100 meters into the air. From a distance they resembled industrial curiosities, unremarkable to the casual observer. To the men and women who understood them, they represented a revolution in warfare that had not yet fully announced itself. These were the radar stations of the chain home network, and they changed everything. The principle behind radar was not uniquely British. German scientists understood the technology, but Britain had translated understanding into application with a speed and a thoroughness that no other nation had matched. The chain home stations could detect aircraft at distances of more than 160 kilometers, giving fighter command the one resource it perpetually lacked in numbers: time. Without radar, British squadrons would have needed to keep aircraft in the air continuously, burning fuel and exhausting pilots against the mere possibility of an attack. With radar, aircraft could remain on the ground, pilots resting, engines cool, until the moment the signal came through and the scramble order was given. It was an economy of force that transformed a numerically inferior defense into something capable of sustained resistance. But radar was only one layer of the system Dowding had built. Below the towers, along the cliffs and fields facing the continent, stood the observer corps. Thousands of civilian volunteers with binoculars and plotting tables, tracking aircraft that had crossed below the radar's effective range and reporting their movements into a network of filter rooms and operations centers. These were ordinary people, farmers, shopkeepers, retired postal workers. They had been trained to identify aircraft silhouettes and estimate height and heading, and they fed their reports into the chain of information with a steadiness that professional soldiers would have been proud to match. Their contribution was unglamorous and largely invisible to the public, but without it, the system could not function. At the center of the network sat the operations rooms, and it was here that the genius of Dowding's design became most visible. Large plotting tables covered with maps of southern England showed the position and progress of incoming raids as information arrived from radar stations and the observer corps. Controllers wearing headsets directed squadrons to intercept with an efficiency that seemed almost uncanny to those who encountered it for the first time. The information flowed in, was filtered and verified, and flowed back out as orders to sector stations, which in turn spoke directly to the pilots already airborne. The whole system, from radar detection to fighter engagement, could function in minutes. For an enemy expecting to face a scrambling, disorganized defense, it was a profoundly unpleasant surprise. Group 11, covering the southeastern approaches to London and the most likely routes for any German assault, fell under the command of Air Vice Marshal Keith Park, a New Zealander whose calm and methodical handling of his squadrons would become one of the distinguishing features of the battle. Park understood Dowding's system intimately and would prove masterful at managing the resources available to him without overcommitting. He rarely sent his full strength against a single raid. He preserved aircraft and pilots by sending enough to engage without gambling everything on any one encounter. It was an approach that frustrated his critics and confused German commanders who expected British defences to eventually exhaust themselves in some decisive mass engagement that never came. Contrast this with the culture taking shape across the water, where Hermann Göring presided over the Luftwaffe with the theatrical confidence of a man who had never seriously considered the possibility of failure. Göring was vain, politically cunning, and personally decorated with enough medals to armor a small vehicle. He had promised the Führer that his air force could subdue Britain, and he seemed to genuinely believe it. His commanders were talented, some of them brilliant, and many were veterans of the Spanish Civil War and the campaigns through Poland and Western Europe. They had seen opponents fold, airfields burn, and air forces collapse. They had every reason to expect the same from Britain. What they could not see, and would spend costly weeks learning, was that the opponent waiting for them was not the disorganized remnant of a defeated ally, but a system built with quiet care by a man they had underestimated completely. Dowding's pilots were young, many of them achingly so. Some had barely finished their training before finding themselves strapped into a fighter and pointed toward the coast. They came from across Britain and beyond, from Canada, from Australia, from New Zealand, from Poland and Czechoslovakia, men who had already lost their countries to the same enemy and who flew with a ferocity born of personal grief as well as duty. They would be asked to perform feats of endurance that no planning document had fully anticipated, to climb and fight and land and climb again, day after day, against an enemy that seemed to have an inexhaustible supply of aircraft and the will to keep sending them. What Dowding had given them was not simply better equipment or better information, though he had given them those things too. He had given them a system, coherent, resilient, and capable of functioning even under pressure, and that system was about to face the most severe test any defensive architecture in the history of air warfare had yet encountered. The summer of 1940 was settling into its warmest days. The beaches of southern England, which in peacetime would have been crowded with visitors, were strung with barbed wire and observation posts. The radar masts stood along the cliffs, humming with their invisible purpose. In the sector stations, the plotters ran drills and refined their procedures. On the airfields, pilots played cards and napped in deck chairs beside their aircraft, waiting for the phone to ring. The German air fleets were assembling across the Channel in numbers that strained imagination. Everything that Dowding had argued for, fought for, and refused to relinquish was now in place. It would have to be enough. Along the eastern and southern coastlines of Britain, something strange had been growing for several years before the first German bomber ever crossed the Channel. Tall steel lattice towers, some rising to over 100 meters, stood in a chain of stations from the northern tip of Scotland down around the belly of England to the Welsh coast. To anyone passing on a country road below, they might have looked like industrial curiosities, the sort of thing that belonged near a power station or a shipyard. But these structures were neither decorative nor incidental. They were the nervous system of an entirely new way of making war, and their existence would prove to be one of the most consequential secrets in the history of armed conflict. At a time when the Luftwaffe's commanders were sketching out their plans with the confidence of men who believed they had already accounted for every British advantage, these towers were quietly doing something that no military force in the world had yet managed at scale. They were watching. In silence, across distances the human eye could never reach, they were watching. The science behind the system had its roots in work conducted across much of the 1930s by a team of British researchers led by a Scottish physicist named Robert Watson Watt. The fundamental principle was not entirely new. The idea that radio waves bounced back from solid objects had been understood in laboratories for some time. What Watson Watt and his colleagues achieved was the translation of that laboratory principle into something operational, something that could detect an aircraft at a distance of 100 miles or more and provide meaningful information about where it was, how high it was flying, and roughly how many aircraft were involved. This was not a theoretical advantage. It was a practical, real-time capability that changed the arithmetic of aerial defense in ways that even its creators were still discovering as the crisis of 1940 approached. The Air Ministry, to its considerable credit, had recognized what the technology represented early enough to fund it, build it, and weave it into a coherent system before the shooting started. The network that emerged from this effort was called the Chain Home System, and its reach along the English coastline gave British air defence an early warning capacity that simply had no parallel anywhere else in the world at that moment. A German aircraft formation assembling over occupied France could be detected almost from the moment it began to form up and move toward the coast. The information was imperfect. Chain Home had limitations in detecting low-flying aircraft, and the height readings were not always precise, but imperfect early warning was still an enormous improvement over no warning at all. Before radar, a defending fighter force had to maintain standing patrols in the air at all times, burning fuel, wearing out engines, exhausting pilots, and still risking being in the wrong place when the blow actually fell. Radar changed that equation completely. Fighters could stay on the ground, resting, refueled, ready, until the system told commanders exactly where they needed to be and roughly when they needed to be there. What made the radar itself only part of the story was the system built around it to turn raw detection data into coordinated action. This was the contribution that tends to receive less attention than the technology itself, but it mattered just as much. When the Chain Home stations detected incoming aircraft, that information flowed through a network of telephone lines and plotting rooms that had been designed with extraordinary care. At Bentley Priory in Middlesex, the headquarters of Fighter Command under Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, a central operations room received filtered information from across the country. Large plotting tables covered with maps showed the tracked positions of German formations, updated in near real time, with colored counters moved by women of the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, using long-handled rakes like croupiers in some high-stakes game where the chips represented human lives. Sector controllers at airfields across the south of England received their orders from this system and passed those orders directly to pilots already sitting in their cockpits. The men and women who operated these rooms had been drilled in their procedures until the process was nearly automatic. When a raid built up over France and began moving north across the water, the information passed through the filter rooms, the group headquarters, and down to the sector controllers in a matter of minutes. A squadron leader climbing into his Spitfire or Hurricane might receive a vector and an altitude before the German pilots across the channel had finished tightening their formation. This compression of the decision cycle, from detection to scramble to intercept, was something the Luftwaffe had not anticipated because it had nothing in its own experience to measure against. German planners had assumed that the RAF would be forced to react to raids already underway, that British fighters would often arrive late and low and already disadvantaged. The radar network meant that this assumption was wrong almost every time it was tested. Germany was not entirely ignorant of radar technology. German scientists had developed their own radar systems, and some senior officers understood the principle well enough. But the specific character of the British chain-home network, its integration with a command and control system designed from the ground up around it, was not something German intelligence had mapped accurately before the battle began. Luftwaffe reconnaissance had photographed the tall masts along the coast, and German analysts had correctly concluded they were some form of detection apparatus. The Luftwaffe did strike several radar stations during the opening weeks of the campaign, and a handful were knocked temporarily off the air. But the attacks were not sustained with the persistence that might have mattered, and the decision was taken at a senior German level that the stations were difficult to destroy and perhaps less important than other targets. This was one of the most costly analytical failures the Luftwaffe made during the entire battle, though it would take months for the full weight of that mistake to become clear. Part of what protected the radar secret was the way the British went to considerable lengths to obscure what the towers were actually doing. When German reconnaissance aircraft approached the coast, they were often intercepted at some distance, which itself created the impression of a capable early warning system, without confirming how that warning was being generated. The Germans occasionally suspected that observer corps reports and conventional means were responsible for the speed of British interceptions. This was plausible enough, because the Royal Observer Corps was in fact a real and functioning part of the system, taking over the tracking of aircraft once they crossed the coast, and radar coverage became less reliable over land. The combination of radar offshore and observers on land created a seamless handover that kept the tracks on the plotting tables consistent and current throughout an engagement. There was also an elegance to the way the British had chosen to build chain home that mattered operationally, even though it looked like a limitation at first glance. The system used relatively long radio wavelengths, which meant the transmitter masts had to be very tall, and the equipment was large and difficult to conceal. A more sophisticated engineering solution might have used shorter wavelengths and smaller equipment, but that technology was not yet reliable enough for the scale required. The British chose to work with what they had, and what they had was good enough. Good enough, built and running and integrated into a working system, was worth infinitely more than something theoretically superior still sitting on a drawing board. Watson Watt himself had articulated something close to this philosophy when arguing for rapid development, the principle that a timely, practical solution must take precedence over a perfect one that arrives too late to matter. For the pilots of Fighter Command, the practical meaning of all this infrastructure was something they experienced rather than analyzed. A young pilot sitting in his aircraft at readiness on a summer morning in 1940 would hear the telephone ring in the dispersal hut, watch the scramble signal go up, and be airborne within minutes, guided by a controller's voice through his headset toward a bearing and an altitude. He might not fully understand why his controller seemed to know so much about where the enemy was before it was visible to the naked eye. Many pilots knew radar existed in a general sense, but the precise mechanics of how it fed information into the system that guided them was not something most had reason to think about deeply. They simply experienced the results, arriving at the right altitude, in roughly the right position, with enough time to set up an attack, rather than scrambling desperately to catch bombers already overhead. The psychological effect of the radar network on RAF commanders was also significant in a way that is easy to underestimate. Dowding, who was by temperament a cautious and methodical man rather than a gambler, was not working entirely blind in a battle where his margin for error was almost zero. He could see the shape of an attack developing before it struck. He could choose to commit reserves or hold them. He could make informed decisions about where the weight of a given raid was likely to fall, rather than guessing and hoping. None of this gave him certainty, and the pressure on him and his group commanders throughout the battle was enormous. But it gave him something rare and precious in warfare: time. A few minutes of warning, reliably delivered, repeatedly, across hundreds of engagements over the course of months. In aggregate, those minutes added up to a margin of survival that would have been impossible to create any other way. When German planners had looked across the Channel in the summer of 1940 and calculated that the RAF could be broken in 4 weeks, they were measuring a force they could see against a force they thought they understood. They counted aircraft, estimated production rates, assessed pilot numbers, and arrived at figures that made the task look demanding but achievable. What they could not properly measure, because they did not properly understand it, was the multiplying effect that radar and the integrated control system gave to every RAF aircraft in the air. A German formation of 200 bombers escorted by fighter cover represented, on paper, an overwhelming weight of metal and firepower aimed at a defending force that was outnumbered in almost every engagement. But those defenders knew where the blow was coming, roughly when it would arrive, and at what altitude they needed to be to meet it. The radar towers standing in the coastal wind, humming with invisible energy, broadcasting their silent alarm with every rotation, quietly cancelled out a very large portion of the numerical advantage that German planners had so carefully calculated. This was the edge that the British had built for themselves in the years of anxious preparation before the war began in earnest. Not a larger air force, not a more powerful engine, not a more heavily armed aircraft, though they had worked on all of those things too. What they had built was a system, a connected, integrated, constantly operating system that gathered information, processed it, and delivered it to the people who needed it, fast enough to matter. As the summer of 1940 advanced toward the confrontation both sides knew was coming, that system was already running, already watching, and already waiting for the moment when it would be put to its most demanding test. By the summer of 1940, the skies above Britain were about to become the proving ground for 2 of the most extraordinary flying machines ever built. They had been conceived in different countries, by different minds, shaped by different visions of what air power should look like and what it should demand of the men who flew it. One was angular, purposeful, and unforgiving, a machine that rewarded discipline and punished hesitation. The other was organic, almost alive in its responsiveness, a machine that seemed to think alongside its pilot rather than merely obey him. Before a single bomb fell on an English airfield, before the first formation of grey-painted bombers crossed the Channel in force, the outcome of the Battle of Britain was already being quietly decided in the design offices and test fields where these two aircraft had taken shape. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 and the Supermarine Spitfire were more than weapons, they were arguments, each one a nation's answer to the question of how a war in the air should be fought and won. The Bf 109 had been born out of urgency and ambition in equal measure. German designers had watched the rapid evolution of fighter aircraft through the 1930s and concluded that speed was everything, that the pilot who arrived fastest and dived hardest would always hold the advantage. The result was a lean, narrow-framed aircraft with a liquid-cooled engine and a fuselage so tight around its pilot that climbing in felt less like boarding a machine and more like strapping one to your back. It was fast in level flight and devastating in a dive, capable of accelerating away from almost anything it encountered in a steep downward run. In the campaigns over Poland and France, it had been nearly untouchable. Enemy pilots who had faced it in those earlier battles spoke of it the way soldiers speak of an opponent they genuinely respect, carefully and with complete honesty about what it could do to you if you gave it the opportunity. But the Bf 109 carried within its exceptional design a set of limitations that its builders had accepted as necessary trade-offs. The same narrow fuselage that made it so aerodynamically clean also made it difficult to handle at low speeds and unforgiving on landing, a fact reflected in the number of aircraft lost, not to enemy fire, but to the simple act of returning to Earth. Its turning circle was wider than pilots would have preferred in a close-quarters fight, and at high altitudes the controls stiffened in ways that demanded constant physical effort from the man at the stick. There was also the matter of range. From German-held airfields in France and the Low Countries, the Bf 109 could reach London, but only barely, and with a fuel reserve that gave pilots over the target area somewhere between 20 and 30 minutes of flying time before the mathematics of survival demanded they turn for home. That constraint, invisible from the ground but absolute in the cockpit, would shape the entire campaign in ways that German planners had not fully calculated. The Spitfire arrived at the war from a very different place. Its designer, Reginald Mitchell, had spent years refining the aerodynamics of high-speed aircraft before illness shortened his life, and he died knowing his creation was close to completion but would not fly in combat under his hand. What he left behind was something that defied easy description. The Spitfire's elliptical wing, that distinctive, almost impractical shape that posed so many manufacturing challenges, gave it a rate of roll and a turning ability that pilots described as visceral, instinctive, closer to riding than to flying. At medium altitudes, in a turning engagement, it could follow an opponent through maneuvers that other aircraft simply could not sustain. Test pilots who flew it for the first time frequently used the same word to describe the experience: natural. It did what you expected it to do, and sometimes more. There was a quality in its handling that forgave small errors and rewarded instinct. And for the young men who would fly it over Britain in the summer and autumn of 1940, that quality would mean the difference between living and dying on more occasions than anyone could count. The two aircraft were not, however, mismatched in any simple or comfortable sense. The The Bf-109 held genuine advantages that could kill a Spitfire pilot if he forgot about them for a moment. In a dive, the German machine pulled away from almost anything the RAF could put against it. And in the early weeks of the battle, this single fact shaped engagements in important ways. A German pilot who found himself in trouble could push forward on the stick, nose down, and vanish into the vertical, something the Spitfire's carburetor-fed engine actually could not immediately follow, because negative G-force cut the fuel supply momentarily and caused the engine to hesitate or cut out entirely. British pilots learned this lesson the hard way in the opening weeks, watching opponents disappear beneath them in dives they could not match. The fix, eventually, was found by a female engineer whose practical solution required little more than a modified fuel line, but in the months before that solution was applied, it represented a genuine tactical disadvantage in the heat of a turning fight. Above the Channel and the green fields of southern England, the two machines met in conditions that neither side had entirely anticipated. The fighting was nothing like the broad, sweeping campaigns over Poland, where German formations had faced outclassed opponents in largely open sky. Here, the engagements were sudden, violent, and desperately close. Formations that stretched for kilometers would fracture within seconds of contact into a chaos of individual duels. Two aircraft, sometimes more, locked in turning, climbing, diving struggles that could cover 50 kilometers and change altitude by 3,000 meters in the span of 3 minutes. In those conditions, the qualities that distinguished one aircraft from another revealed themselves not in textbook comparisons, but in the instant decisions of exhausted men pulling hard on controls at the edge of their aircraft's performance envelope. The pilots themselves were as important as the machines they flew, and in the summer of 1940, both sides could count their best men among the finest aviators in the world. German fighter pilots who crossed the Channel had in many cases spent years at war. They had flown over Spain during the Civil War there, had engaged Polish and French opponents, and had developed a tactical sophistication that their training establishments were rightly proud of. The German Finger Four formation, 4 aircraft arranged like the spread fingers of an outstretched hand, had become the standard for modern fighter tactics, adopted eventually by air forces around the world because it simply worked better than the formations that had come before it. These were not men who needed to be taught how to fight. They arrived over Britain already hardened. The RAF pilots who rose to meet them were a more varied group than popular imagination has sometimes allowed. Alongside Englishmen, Scots, Welsh, and Irish flew men from Poland, Czechoslovakia, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and a dozen other corners of the world. The Polish and Czech pilots who had escaped occupied Europe to fly with the RAF brought something fierce and particular to the battle, a personal dimension that transformed every engagement into something beyond national defense. For them it was not abstract. Many had watched their countries fall. Some had lost family members in the occupation. When they climbed into a Spitfire or a Hurricane, they were not merely defending Britain. They were fighting for everything they had already lost, and that gave them a quality in the air that their RAF instructors sometimes found difficult to quantify but impossible to ignore. What the RAF did possess in abundance, even when pilot numbers stretched thin, was quality of training at its highest levels. The men commanding squadrons and leading flights had often come through a system that emphasized air discipline, tactical awareness, and the ability to make fast decisions under extreme pressure. Translating that training into effective performance against the Bf-109 required learning quickly, and in the opening weeks of serious fighting, The learning curve was steep and unforgiving. Pilots who had trained in tight formation flying had to unlearn some of what they knew and adopt the looser, more flexible groupings that combat demanded. The ones who adapted quickly survived. The ones who could not, did not. There was a quality to the Bf 109 that its German pilots understood intimately, and that understanding was itself a kind of weapon. They knew its limits as well as its strengths, knew when to commit to a turning fight and when to decline it, knew the exact altitudes at which their aircraft performed best, and where the Spitfire's advantages began to grow. This tactical self-awareness, built from years of campaign experience, made German fighter pilots opponents of extraordinary sophistication. They were not simply better armed men in faster machines. They were thinkers, and they adapted to new information with the same speed that the British were adapting to them. And yet, beneath all the technical comparison and tactical calculation, there was something in the contest between these two aircraft that resisted reduction to data. The Spitfire in particular had acquired a quality almost immediately upon its introduction to the world, a reputation that preceded it wherever it flew and preceded it into the minds of the men who would face it. German pilots who encountered it in France had returned with accounts that their commanders received with the kind of attention reserved for genuinely important intelligence. The British fighter, they noted, was not merely capable. In the hands of a skilled pilot, it was something else entirely. What exactly that something was proved difficult to define in a technical report, but every pilot who had met one in a serious fight understood it the moment they felt their own aircraft labor into a turn that the Spitfire completed with apparent ease. Understanding what the RAF had built was one thing. Finding a reliable answer to it in the confined airspace above Britain would prove to be something else entirely. What both machines shared, above all of their differences, was the absolute demand they placed on the men who flew them. No amount of technical advantage survived pilot exhaustion, poor judgment, or bad luck. The Bf 109's speed was useless if its pilot misjudged his fuel and had to turn for France with a fight unfinished. The Spitfire's turn radius meant nothing if its pilot flew straight and level for 1 second too long. These aircraft were tools of extraordinary precision, and like all precision tools, they rewarded skill and punished carelessness with a ruthless consistency. The summer ahead would test both machines and both nations' pilots to the limits of what human beings and engineered metal could endure together. What was already clear, even before the great formations assembled over France and turned their noses toward the grey-green water of the English Channel, was that neither side had brought anything less than its very best to the fight. The summer of 1940 arrived over the English Channel with a deceptive beauty. The sea lay flat and grey-green beneath high skies, gulls wheeling over the white chalk cliffs of Dover as though nothing had changed, but something had changed, irrevocably and completely. Across that narrow stretch of water, less than 35 kilometers at its shortest crossing, the machinery of the most powerful military force the modern world had yet produced sat waiting. Soldiers drilled on French beaches, engineers surveyed harbors, and above the occupied coastline, aircraft with black crosses on their wings began to move. Quietly at first, probing, testing, like a hand pressed against a wall, searching for a door. The German reconnaissance missions of early July were not raids in any dramatic sense. They were something more disciplined, and in many ways more dangerous. Systematic observation, careful and cold. High-altitude aircraft, stripped of excess weight, and climbing beyond the comfortable ceiling of conventional interception, swept long arcs across southern England and out over the Channel shipping lanes. Their cameras recorded what their pilots saw. The images were processed and studied. German intelligence officers bent over tables covered in photographs, measuring shadow lengths to determine the height of structures, counting aircraft dispersed around grass airfields, noting the strange skeletal towers that rose at intervals along the English coast. They noted them, discussed them, and then largely moved past them. A miscalculation that would carry consequences far beyond anything those analysts could have imagined as they sat in their requisitioned rooms in northern France. The Royal Air Force saw them coming, and that is the detail that matters. Not every sortie, not every high crossing, but enough. The radar chain, those same towers the German analysts had noticed and dismissed, fed a stream of information into the filter rooms at Fighter Command Headquarters at Bentley Priory, northwest of London. Operators translated the raw signal returns into map positions. Controllers plotted the tracks of incoming aircraft on enormous glass-top tables, and sector commanders began to understand, in these early weeks, just how much information they would have at their disposal when the real battle arrived. Every German reconnaissance pass was, unknowingly, a rehearsal for the British system rather than a reconnaissance of it. The very thing the Germans were trying to map was quietly mapping them in return. Along the Channel, the first genuine skirmishes began to spark. German aircraft probed the convoy routes that threaded through the Dover Strait and out into the approaches of the Thames estuary. Britain depended on these convoys: coal, food, raw materials moving in slow processions of merchant ships beneath the looming English cliffs. Germany understood this dependency and began to probe at it, sending small formations of bombers escorted by fighters to harry the shipping and force the RAF into the air. These were not the overwhelming formations that would define August. They were measured incursions, designed as much to observe British responses as to inflict damage. The Luftwaffe wanted to understand how quickly the RAF could respond, what tactics its pilots preferred, and whether those radar towers translated into meaningful tactical advantage. The Germans were gathering data, and they believed the data was telling them what they hoped to hear. In the cockpits of Hurricanes and Spitfires scrambled from airfields scattered across Kent and Sussex and Hampshire, a generation of young men began their education. Some had already fought in France, and they carried with them the hard knowledge of what German aircraft could do at close quarters. Others were arriving from training with skills that were technically adequate but experientially thin, hours logged, but none of them the kind of hours that teach a man how to stay alive when another aircraft is behind him and closing. In those early July engagements, often involving no more than a handful of aircraft on each side, the learning curve was brutal and personal. The channel below offered no soft landing for pilots who misjudged a turning fight or held a dive a fraction too long. What came out of those early skirmishes, though, was the beginning of a shared vocabulary, tactics that worked, approaches that did not, an instinct for the Messerschmitt's behavior that no classroom could have provided. The German fighter pilots who crossed the Channel in those weeks were, by almost any measure, extremely capable. Many had accumulated genuine combat experience in Poland, in the campaign in Norway, and most recently, in the swift and overwhelming conquest of France. They had fought in the air and won, repeatedly and convincingly, against opponents who were skilled and determined. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 was a formidable machine, fast, well-armed, and handled with the confidence of men who had come to expect victory as the natural outcome of their appearances in the sky. When those pilots returned to their airfields in France after the first Channel skirmishes and reported what they had encountered, their assessments were, on balance, optimistic. The RAF was fighting back, yes, but Germany had more aircraft, more experienced pilots, and the momentum of an unbroken run of success, stretching back almost a year. The arithmetic seemed straightforward. The British would run out before they did. What the German pilots could not see, what the German High Command could not see, was the infrastructure behind each British pilot who climbed into a cockpit and flew to meet them. They could count the aircraft they destroyed. They could report the number of RAF fighters that went into the Channel or trailed smoke back toward the English coast. What they could not count were the aircraft rolling out of factories in the English Midlands every week, or the pilots completing their final training sorties at airfields well beyond the battle zone. The RAF was not a fixed quantity. It was a system, and the system was being managed, carefully and deliberately, by men who understood exactly what they were doing. Air Chief Marshal Dowding had spent years constructing this architecture, and those first July skirmishes were not merely a trial by fire. They were a functioning test of a machine built specifically to survive a war of attrition. The convoys themselves suffered. Ships were hit, some were sunk, and the men who crewed them endured an experience of extraordinary isolation and vulnerability, lying low in the water, slow and visible, beneath skies that could produce enemy aircraft with almost no warning. The debate within the Admiralty and Fighter Command over how aggressively to defend these convoys would persist throughout July and into August, because every fighter sent over the Channel to protect a merchant ship was a fighter operating at maximum range, far from the safety of a home airfield, and more vulnerable to the German fighters that came with the bombers. Dowding was deeply reluctant to spend his pilots on convoy defense, when he knew, with a certainty that sustained him through weeks of pressure from above, that the real assault was still coming. He parceled out his resources with a precision that sometimes appeared to those around him as coldness. It was not coldness, it was calculation in the service of survival. By mid-July, the pattern of the skirmishing had established itself clearly enough for both sides to draw conclusions. For the Luftwaffe, the engagement figures appeared encouraging. Aircraft tallies, pilot assessments, the observable damage to the convoys, all of it suggested that when the full weight of German air power was applied, the RAF would buckle. Goering, presiding over his air command with the bombastic certainty that had become his signature, began shaping in his mind the outline of a decisive campaign. His airfields were full of aircraft. His pilots were confident. His commanders were ready. The question was not whether the RAF could be destroyed. The question was how long it would take. For the RAF, the same weeks produced a more nuanced accounting. There had been losses, some of them painful, pilots who would not be replaced easily, and aircraft that had cost factories and workers months of careful assembly. But the system had worked. The radar chain had functioned. The ground controllers had proven that they could vector fighters to intercept with a reliability that transformed the mathematics of aerial defense. And critically, the pilots who survived those early Channel fights had learned things about their aircraft, about their enemy, and about themselves that could not be taught any other way. They returned from those scraps over the grey water, carrying information in their hands and their instincts, information that would keep them alive in the weeks ahead, when the sky above England would grow thick with aircraft, and every second of reaction time would carry the weight of a human life. The English coast in July offered an outward stillness that belied everything occurring above it. Farmers worked fields that had been worked for centuries. Families picnicked on grass that looked down over the Dover Strait, watching the contrails draw white lines across the high blue sky, the way a child might watch a spectacle whose full significance lies just beyond their comprehension. Along the cliff tops, the radar towers stood against the sea wind, their antennas rotating with the patient indifference of machines that did not need to understand the purpose they served. Below ground and in converted country houses, and in modest brick buildings behind guarded fences, the people who did understand that purpose worked around the clock in shifts, building a picture of the sky that no enemy pilot could see and no enemy planner had truly accounted for. In those early skirmishes, both sides were learning, but they were not learning the same things, and that difference, invisible in July, would become everything in August. In the summer of 1940, the German High Command stood at the threshold of conquest. France had fallen, the Low Countries were secured. Nazi armies controlled the continent from the Atlantic to the Polish frontier, and German planners gazed across the Channel toward an island that remained stubbornly unconquered. For Hitler, Britain represented an unfinished piece of business, a defiant nation that refused to acknowledge German superiority or sue for peace. The solution, the German leadership believed, lay not in the patience of diplomacy, but in the overwhelming application of force. Air Force, specifically. It fell to Hermann Göring, the Reichsmarschall of the Luftwaffe, to deliver what ground forces could not: the destruction of the Royal Air Force, and with it, the ability to defend against invasion. Göring accepted the challenge with the confidence of a man who had never truly failed, or perhaps more accurately, a man whose failures had been forgotten by a regime that rewarded only success. Hermann Göring was not a pilot himself, though he cultivated the image of one. He had been a fighter ace in the First World War, a hero of the Kaiser's air service, who survived that conflict when so many of his fellow aviators did not. That war had ended more than 20 years prior, but Göring had never abandoned the identity of the warrior. He wore his medals with theatrical precision, spoke with the authority of someone accustomed to absolute obedience, and possessed an appetite for power that matched his appetite for luxury. His palaces were lavish, his tastes expensive, his manner imperious. When Hitler asked him whether the Luftwaffe could destroy the RAF, Göring did not hesitate, did not equivocate, did not counsel caution. Instead, he made a promise that would echo through the corridors of German military command with consequences that neither he nor Hitler fully anticipated. He promised to crush the Royal Air Force in 4 weeks. 4 weeks. It was an extraordinary claim, the kind of bold assertion that appealed to Hitler's sense of destiny and his belief in German superiority. The Führer, who had watched the Luftwaffe pulverize Polish defenses and shatter French resistance, saw no reason to doubt his Reichsmarschall. Göring, in turn, allowed his recent successes to obscure the challenges that lay ahead. He had not yet encountered an enemy quite like the British. The German Air Force that stood ready in the summer of 1940 was, by any measure of the era, formidable. The Luftwaffe possessed more than 2,600 aircraft immediately available for operations, a fleet that dwarfed the RAF's operational strength. German pilots had been hardened by campaigns in Spain during the Civil War, by the invasion of Poland, and by the blitzkrieg through France and the Low Countries. They had seen air superiority used as a tool of conquest. They had watched bombers work in concert with ground forces, turning the skies themselves into an instrument of military dominance. The organization of the Luftwaffe was efficient, its chain of command clear, its doctrine refined through actual combat. Göring could point to these facts with justifiable pride, and he did so when he met with Hitler and the other members of the High Command to discuss the forthcoming operation. He spoke of 4 weeks as though it were not an ambition but an inevitability, a simple matter of applying sufficient force to an inferior opponent. That the RAF was not in fact inferior was a judgment that did not occur to him, or if it did occur, was dismissed as the pessimism of lesser men. The campaign that Göring envisioned would bear the codename Unternehmen Adler, Operation Eagle. The objectives were precise and, on the surface, achievable. The Luftwaffe would establish air superiority over the Channel and the southern coast of England. It would destroy the RAF's fighter aircraft, eliminate the airfields from which they operated, disrupt aircraft production, and neutralize the radar stations that British intelligence insisted on building along the coast. Once these goals were accomplished, once German fighters ruled the skies unchallenged, the path would be clear for Operation Sea Lion, the invasion itself. Massive formations of transport aircraft and towed gliders would carry German soldiers across the Channel. Naval vessels would provide covering fire. Paratroops would seize key positions inland. The British Army, having suffered catastrophic losses at Dunkirk just weeks earlier, would find itself outflanked and overwhelmed. London would fall. The British government would flee or surrender. The war in Western Europe would be concluded by the autumn. It was a plan that made perfect sense to men who had not yet encountered successful resistance, who believed that the application of sufficient force would break any opponent, and who had never seriously contemplated the possibility of failure. The Adlertag, Eagle Day, was scheduled for the 13th of August 1940. The date was chosen with care, timed to allow for final preparations and calculated to coincide with a period when weather conditions over southern England were expected to be favourable for large-scale air operations. The month of August presented a window of opportunity that would not remain open indefinitely. As autumn approached, shorter daylight hours and more unpredictable weather would complicate operations. Göring was acutely aware that he had a limited time in which to achieve decisive results. 4 weeks meant that the critical period would conclude in mid-September, before the seasonal transition rendered large-scale bombing campaigns more difficult. The date of the 13th of August was not arbitrary. It was the culmination of weeks of planning, the point at which the Luftwaffe would transition from probing attacks and small-scale engagements into an overwhelming display of force designed to break British resistance once and for all. Göring communicated the date to his commanders with the same confidence he had displayed to Hitler. The preparations began in earnest. Across northern France and the Low Countries, German airfields became beehives of activity. Mechanics worked around the clock to service aircraft, replacing worn components, refueling tanks, loading ammunition. Ground crews organized bombs into stacks, sorting them by tonnage and type, preparing them for rapid loading onto the bombers that would carry them north toward British targets. Supply lines stretched across occupied Europe, ensuring that replacement aircraft, spare parts, fuel, and ordnance flowed continuously to the forward airfields where the Luftwaffe's strike force assembled. The sheer logistical undertaking was staggering, the kind of mobilization that only a military force backed by the resources of an entire continent could achieve. German commanders briefed their pilots on the objectives, the tactics, the expected opposition. Senior officers spoke of the inferiority of British aircraft and the exhaustion of British pilots. Intelligence reports, some accurate and some wildly optimistic, painted a picture of an enemy weakened by recent defeats and demoralized by the fall of France. German pilots were told that they would encounter only scattered resistance, that air superiority would be achieved swiftly, and that the campaign would proceed according to schedule. Few men questioned these assertions, and those who did kept their doubts to themselves. In Britain, the mood was starkly different. Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding and his staff at RAF Fighter Command Headquarters understood with crystalline clarity what was coming. Intelligence assessments, some derived from intercepted German radio signals and others from reconnaissance photographs taken by RAF aircraft operating at the very edge of German defences, indicated that a major German operation was imminent. The scale of German preparation was evident even to casual observers. Thousands of German aircraft were being concentrated in airfields within striking distance of Britain. The barges that would be needed for invasion were being assembled in ports along the French coast. The Germans were not attempting to conceal their preparations. They did not believe concealment was necessary. They believed that their numerical superiority, their recent victories, and their confidence in the Luftwaffe's ability were sufficient to cow their enemies into submission. Dowding did not share that assessment. He knew that his fighters were equal or superior to their German counterparts in crucial respects. He knew that his ground control system gave the RAF a tactical advantage that the Germans did not possess. He knew that his nation would fight because the alternative was slavery. What he did not know, in the days immediately preceding Eagle Day, was whether that knowledge and that determination would be sufficient. The British pilots who would soon face the Luftwaffe's onslaught spent those final days of July and early August in a state of peculiar readiness. They knew that something momentous was approaching, though the precise timing remained uncertain. They trained, they flew practice sorties, they reviewed tactics that would be crucial in the weeks to come. They also did what fighter pilots have always done when facing the unknown. They maintained routines that gave structure and familiarity to their days, routines that would become impossible to maintain once the battle truly began. They wrote letters home, perhaps sensing that these might be among the last they would ever write. They formed closer friendships with the men in their squadrons, understanding that shared danger creates bonds that peacetime can never replicate. They spoke with the gallows humor that combat soldiers have always employed, cracking jokes about German aircraft and German commanders, about the odds they would face, about the probability that some of them would not survive the coming weeks. Beneath the humor lay genuine fear, the fear that all warriors experience when they know that death is imminent and that the time remaining might be measured in days rather than months. The contrast between the German confidence and the British readiness was profound. On one side of the Channel stood an air force that believed itself invincible, commanded by an officer who had promised his ruler that victory was merely a matter of executing a predetermined plan. The Luftwaffe had crushed every opponent it had yet faced. Its pilots were experienced, its aircraft modern, its organization efficient. There seemed to be no reason to doubt that the British would prove any more resilient than the Poles, the Belgians, the Dutch, or the French. On the other side of the Channel stood an air force that possessed no illusions about the difficulty of the task before it, commanded by an officer who knew exactly what resources were available and what would be required to make use of them. The RAF had never defeated an opponent of the Luftwaffe's magnitude, but it had never faced a challenge without attempting to rise to it. Both sides prepared for battle with the understanding that the stakes could not be higher, that the outcome of the campaign would determine not only the fate of Britain, but the course of the entire war. As the 13th of August approached, the final preparations accelerated. German airfields buzzed with frantic activity as mechanics worked through the night to ensure that every aircraft would be ready for the opening of the offensive. Briefing officers prepared their pilots for the climactic assault. Maps were studied, routes memorized, objectives confirmed. The Reichsmarschall himself travelled to the forward airfields to address his commanders, to reinforce the importance of the coming campaign, to remind them of the promise he had made to the Führer. His message was clear: the Luftwaffe would destroy the RAF, Britain would fall, and Germany would stand unopposed as master of Europe. This was not a possibility, but a certainty, not a goal, but an inevitability. What Goering did not tell his commanders, what he perhaps did not even fully comprehend, was that he was about to engage an enemy that would refuse to be broken according to schedule, that would adapt faster than his planners anticipated, and that would extract a price for German victory far higher than any he had yet been forced to pay. In the opposite corner of the Channel, RAF squadrons stood to their readiness stations as the night of the 12th of August gave way to the morning of the 13th. Pilots checked their aircraft one final time, verifying that guns were charged, fuel tanks filled, oxygen systems functional. Ground crews attended to last-minute details, ensuring that nothing mechanical would fail when lives depended on performance. The radar stations along the coast, those invisible sentinels that would prove so crucial, were manned and active, their operators scanning the skies above occupied France and the Channel for the first signs of the approaching enemy. Controllers at Fighter Command prepared to direct squadrons to intercept points, to husband their resources, to position their fighters where they would be most effective. Dowding himself visited a fighter squadron in the days before Eagle Day, speaking briefly with the men who would bear the brunt of the Luftwaffe's assault. He did not promise them victory, nor did he minimize the danger they would face. He simply assured them that their efforts would make a difference, that every pilot who scrambled against the German formations would be contributing to something larger than themselves. It was not a rousing speech, but it was an honest one, and fighter pilots understood the value of honesty about their prospects. The stage was set. The Luftwaffe had gathered its forces, concentrated its resources, and prepared for a campaign that its commanders believed would conclude in 4 weeks with the utter destruction of British air power. The RAF, outnumbered and outgunned, had positioned itself to resist, had refined its tactics, had honed its organization, and had armed itself not only with aircraft and ammunition, but with the knowledge that this battle was not about territory or resources or political advantage. It was about survival itself. In the early hours of the 13th of August 1940, as the sun began to rise over the Channel and the first German aircraft began to taxi onto their runways, neither side understood fully what the coming weeks would demand of them. Neither side could have predicted the extent to which human courage, technological innovation, and sheer stubborn determination would reshape the character of the battle before it was concluded. The promise made by Goering to Hitler would soon be tested against the resilience of a nation that refused to surrender and a military force that would not break. Eagle Day was about to dawn, and with it, the myth of German invincibility would begin to fracture. The waiting ends on the 13th of August, 1940. For weeks, German bombers have circled the English coast like predators, testing the perimeter of a cage, seeking weakness, probing for any opening in the British defence. But this morning is different. This morning is the culmination of everything Hermann Goering has promised to his Führer, the day when the Luftwaffe will strike with such overwhelming force that British air resistance will shatter like glass beneath a hammer blow. The German Air Marshal has guaranteed Hitler that within 4 weeks the Royal Air Force will cease to exist as a fighting force. He has named this operation Adlertag, Eagle Day, and the name itself carries the weight of absolute confidence. In bases scattered across occupied France and the Low Countries, mechanics make final checks to thousands of aircraft. Pilots study maps marked with red circles indicating their targets. Ground crews load ammunition and fuel tanks with methodical precision. The sky itself seems to hold its breath. At airfields across southern England, RAF pilots understand that this day will be different from all that came before. The previous weeks of small skirmishes and probing attacks have given them a grim clarity about what is coming. Intelligence reports, radar observations, and the sheer accumulation of enemy activity all point towards something immense. The British have stripped fighter squadrons of every available pilot, calling men back from leave, assigning newly trained replacements to frontline units, concentrating everything into the hands of the men who will fly today. They know that somewhere across the Channel the enemy is massing. They know they will be outnumbered. And they wait, because waiting is all that can be done until the Germans commit themselves and show their hand. The first wave comes in the early afternoon. More than 1,300 German aircraft rise from bases in France and the Low Countries in a coordinated assault so vast that radar operators can barely believe what their screens are showing. The formation stretches across miles of sky, bombers in tight defensive boxes with fighter escort weaving above and around them. German Me-109 fighters fly ahead of the bombers, their task to clear the sky of any RAF resistance. German twin-engine fighters escort from the sides and above. The noise of so many engines creates a sound like the approach of a natural disaster, growing louder and louder as the formations near the English coast. Below, in the operations rooms and radar stations, British controllers track the incoming tide with growing urgency. They plot the vectors, estimate the strength, calculate the likely targets, and then they begin to scramble. The telephone lines light up with urgent calls to airfields across the southeast. Squadron commanders receive the order and sprint toward their waiting aircraft. Pilots run across concrete, pulling on flight jackets and checking oxygen connections. Engines cough to life with angry roars. The Spitfires and Hurricanes that will meet this German onslaught begin to taxi toward the runways, their wheels kicking up dust in the summer heat. There is no time for lengthy briefings, no opportunity for detailed planning. The pilots know the drill by now. They will climb to altitude, they will find the enemy, and they will fight. The ground crews stand back and watch the fighters disappear into the blue sky, knowing that some of the men climbing into those cockpits will not return. The interception happens over the Channel and along the coast of Kent and Sussex. RAF fighters find the German formations, and the sky erupts into chaos. The Messerschmitts respond immediately, peeling away from their escort positions to meet the British threat. What follows is not a battle in any organized sense, but rather a sprawling engagement across dozens of miles, hundreds of aircraft, involved in individual combats that fold into each other like waves in a turbulent sea. A Spitfire pilot finds himself on the tail of a bomber and presses his gun button, tracer rounds streaming toward his target. A Messerschmitt dives onto a Hurricane from above and behind, another pilot's life measured in the precision of a few seconds of deflection shooting. The roar of engines and the chatter of machine guns fills the air. Smoke trails mark the paths of damaged aircraft, descending toward the earth below. The German bombers that do manage to press through toward their targets strike with devastating force. Airfields near Dover and Eastchurch receive waves of bombs that crater runways and destroy hangars. The radar station at Rye is hit, and the precision of the attack suggests that the Germans have better knowledge of British air defences than the RAF commanders had realised. Aircraft factories become targets, particularly the supermarine works where Spitfires are built. Damage is severe in some locations. Buildings burn, equipment is destroyed. Some RAF pilots are killed on the ground before they even reach their aircraft. The day takes on the character of a nightmare in which the enemy seems to come from every direction at once. Waves of bombers following waves of bombers, each defended by seemingly endless fighters. But the British hold. They scramble more squadrons, bring in reinforcements from airfields further north, and commit every pilot they can put into the air. What becomes clear as the day progresses is that the mathematics of this battle favor neither side cleanly. The German bombers suffer heavy losses in their attempts to complete their bombing runs against fighter opposition. The RAF fighters that intercept them die too, pilots killed when their aircraft are shot down, others bailing out into the sky beneath parachutes. The German fighter escorts prove more than capable of handling the British defenders in one-on-one combat, and on several occasions, German Messerschmitts inflict severe casualties on RAF squadrons. A British squadron loses half its strength in a single engagement with Me-109s. Another squadron is caught at low altitude and suffers devastating casualties. The skill of individual pilots becomes the deciding factor in these moments, and some German pilots have already proven themselves to be among the finest flyers in the world. But the RAF pilots are no less skilled, and they have the advantage of fighting over their own territory, knowing that if they are shot down, they have a chance of survival and recovery that an enemy pilot does not possess. By the middle of the afternoon, wave after wave of German formations have either completed their bombing runs and turned for home, or have been so disrupted by fighter opposition that they have been forced to scatter and retreat. The continuous stream of German aircraft continues throughout the day, but the initial overwhelming assault that Goering had envisioned has not achieved the results he promised. The RAF has taken serious losses. Multiple airfields have been damaged. Some aircraft factories have suffered significant harm, but the British have not collapsed. Their fighters are still rising to meet the enemy, and as the day wears on, the German pilots begin to feel the weight of continuous combat and growing doubts about achieving decisive victory. As evening approaches, the final waves of German bombers turn homeward, their bomb loads dropped, their objectives either achieved or abandoned. The RAF fighters pursue some of the retreating formations, claiming additional victims. British pilots who have flown 3 and 4 sorties during the day, exhausted to the point where their hands shake from fatigue, force their damaged aircraft back toward their bases to land and refuel and prepare to do it again if the enemy returns. The sun begins its descent toward the horizon, painting the western sky orange and pink. The noise of engines gradually diminishes. The battle appears to be ending, though the smoke rising from various points across the English landscape testifies to the intensity of what has transpired. But the true significance of Eagle Day emerges only as the calculations begin. The Luftwaffe has committed roughly 1,300 aircraft to the assault, a concentration of force that represents some of the strongest effort the German Air Force can bring to bear on any single day. The bombers have reached their targets and caused damage, but the losses suffered are staggering. German aircraft shot down or damaged beyond repair number somewhere in the range of 50 to 60 aircraft, a higher attrition rate than even pessimistic German commanders had anticipated. More significant than the raw numbers is the psychological impact. These are not losses that can be absorbed easily by a force that was supposed to be invincible. These are not results that match the promises that Goering made to Hitler about crushing the RAF in 4 weeks. The German Air Marshal faces the reality that his confident predictions may have been based more on hope than on careful analysis of British defensive capabilities. In the RAF operations rooms and among the pilots themselves, there is recognition that while the day has been costly, the outcome is not a German victory. The bombers have come in enormous numbers, yet the British have met them and forced them to retreat. Yes, British aircraft have been lost. Yes, British pilots have been killed. The infrastructure of the air defense has been damaged in places. But the fundamental system has held. The radar stations, despite being targeted, have largely continued to function. The airfields, though cratered, have been repaired or bypassed. The aircraft factories, though struck, have not been destroyed. And critically, British fighters are still rising to meet the enemy. For the first time, the myth of German invincibility has been challenged not by ideology or hope, but by cold military fact. The Luftwaffe is not invincible. The RAF can resist. The battle will not be quick or easy, but it will be a battle rather than a slaughter. The men on both sides who fought on Eagle Day carry the exhaustion and the adrenaline and the knowledge of their losses with them as they prepare for what comes next. They understand that this is only the beginning of a much longer struggle. The Luftwaffe has suffered a setback, but remains a formidable force with vast reserves of aircraft and trained pilots. The RAF has held its ground, but at serious cost, with pilot losses that cannot be easily replaced, and damage to critical infrastructure that must be repaired quickly. The weather will determine whether tomorrow brings another assault or a temporary respite. The momentum of the battle has shifted, but only slightly. What is certain is that 13 August 1940 will not be remembered as the day the RAF was destroyed. It will be remembered instead as the day the illusion of German invincibility first cracked, barely perceptibly but irreversibly. The respite that followed Eagle Day proved illusory. The German Air Command, stung by losses but undeterred, recognized that a single day of assault could not break the Royal Air Force. What was needed was not one hammer blow, but rather the relentless weight of an anvil, pressing down day after day until British resistance simply collapsed under the accumulated burden. Throughout the middle weeks of August, the Luftwaffe returned again and again to the skies above England. The attacks became a rhythm, a terrible drumbeat that defined each waking hour for the defenders below. The German High Command had learned from their first major offensive and adapted their approach with methodical precision. Rather than concentrating all forces in a single massive assault, they now dispersed their bombers and fighters across multiple waves, keeping the RAF perpetually mobilized and exhausted. The variety in German tactics caught the British defenders off balance initially. Sometimes the Luftwaffe sent escorted bombers to strike at aircraft factories and airfields in daylight, forcing the RAF into direct aerial combat. Other times they sent fighter bombers that could drop their ordnance and race back across the Channel before the slower British interceptors could close the distance. At still other moments, they launched high-altitude reconnaissance runs that pulled British fighters up to altitude where the Messerschmitt held its advantage in speed. Every variation was designed to keep Air Chief Marshal Dowding's defenders guessing and off balance. The physical and mental toll on RAF pilots intensified with each passing day. A pilot might be scrambled 4 or 5 times in a single day, each time climbing to altitude with adrenaline surging through his body, knowing that somewhere beyond the cloud layer an enemy was waiting. The German bombers flew at altitudes ranging from 15,000 to 30,000 feet, and climbing to intercept them meant the RAF fighters were working at their peak physical demand within minutes of takeoff. Oxygen systems sometimes malfunctioned, forcing pilots to descend or suffer the creeping confusion of hypoxia. Cockpits were cold even in the height of summer, and the constant pressure of combat flying strained nerves and muscles in ways that peacetime training could never fully replicate. The rotation system that allowed pilots rest was breaking down under the sheer volume of sorties required. Experienced flight commanders found themselves flying 2 or 3 combat missions before breakfast, then scrambling again in the afternoon as fresh German formations appeared on the radar screens. Squadron strength fell as attrition mounted. Young pilots, sometimes with fewer than a dozen hours of fighter combat experience, were being thrown into battles against seasoned Luftwaffe veterans who had fought over Poland and France. The mathematics of air combat are brutally straightforward. An experienced pilot has a far higher chance of shooting down enemy aircraft and surviving to fight again than a novice does. For the first time since the campaign began, serious officers within the RAF hierarchy began to wonder aloud whether pilot losses could be sustained. The German attacks shifted focus with calculating precision. Having discovered that the RAF's radar stations provided the crucial advantage to the defenders, German air commanders ordered concentrated strikes against these vulnerable installations. The radar towers were not heavily defended and could be damaged by determined bombing runs. Several stations were struck and temporarily put out of action in late August, creating brief but dangerous gaps in British air defence coverage. When a radar station went down, the RAF lost precious minutes of warning time. What had previously been a fight where British fighters could intercept German bombers while they were still over the Channel became instead a scramble to get airborne before the bombers were already overhead. Some RAF pilots flew up to meet German aircraft that were already at their target, a scenario that reversed every advantage the defenders possessed. Yet even as the Germans struck at radar stations, they failed to fully appreciate how dependent their success had become on the very system they were trying to destroy. The radar operators, working in their stations for hours at a time, understood that every minute the equipment functioned could mean the difference between intercepted bombers and successful attacks. Damage repair teams worked around the clock, and in many cases, radar stations that were struck returned to operational status within hours or days rather than weeks. The British commitment to keeping radar functional represented a kind of quiet heroism that received no medals and left no visible scars. The targets expanded as August progressed. Aircraft factories became priority objectives. The supermarine works at Woolworth, which produced the Spitfire, received repeated attention from German bombers. The factory was struck multiple times, and the disruption to production became severe enough that senior RAF commanders worried they might run out of fighters before they ran out of pilots. Yet the workers at these factories responded with a determination that matched that of the pilots defending them. When the supermarine works were damaged, the workforce labored through the night to restore production. Component manufacturing was dispersed to smaller facilities across the country, making it harder for the Germans to locate and destroy critical production choke points. Aircraft that were damaged in combat were salvaged, repaired, and returned to service with a speed that seemed almost miraculous. The question of whether Britain could manufacture enough fighters to replace losses became a race, and by the narrowest of margins, Britain was winning that race even as the human cost mounted terribly. The intensity of combat in these middle weeks of August created moments of profound personal drama amid the broader strategic struggle. Pilots who had survived multiple engagements found themselves making split-second decisions at altitudes where the margin between life and death measured only feet or seconds. A pilot might see a Messerschmitt's cannon fire stream past his windscreen and instinctively throw his Spitfire into a turn that the German fighter could not match due to its heavier wing loading. The sound of bullets striking an aircraft was something that every combat pilot learned to recognize and dread, the sharp rattling that meant your machine was being torn apart around you. Some pilots were shot down and managed to bail out, parachuting into English countryside or even over the Channel itself, where they faced the desperate choice between ditching in the sea and trying to nurse a crippled fighter back to land. The human dimension of the battle was woven through with genuine comradeship between pilots in the same squadron. These men flew together, ate together in the ready rooms, and grieved together when friends did not return from sorties. The loss of a talented and well-liked pilot affected entire squadrons, not merely as a reduction in fighting strength, but as a blow to morale and camaraderie. Yet the German assault, for all its intensity, was also beginning to reveal structural weaknesses in the Luftwaffe's strategy. The fighter escort requirements that the bombers demanded meant that German fighters were tethered to the speed and altitude of the bombers they protected. This reduced the tactical flexibility of the Messerschmitt, which was fastest when flown at low altitude or in a steep dive. Tying the fighters to bombers meant they could not roam at altitude where they might achieve energy advantages over the Spitfires. The German bombers themselves were not particularly fast, and their defensive firepower, while significant, was not sufficient to fight their way through determined fighter opposition without fighter cover. This created a dependency relationship where the success of bombing attacks was entirely contingent on the ability of fighters to maintain protective formations. As August progressed, this relationship began to show signs of strain. German commanders noted that unescorted bombers attempting daylight raids suffered catastrophic losses and reluctantly accepted that protection was mandatory. Yet providing that protection meant fewer fighter bombers on independent missions and fewer opportunities for the Messerschmitt to fight on its own terms. The tactical advantage had shifted subtly but decisively toward the defenders. The weather played its own role in the struggle. Summer in southern England is not always clear, and increasingly cloud cover limited the ability of both sides to locate each other. The Luftwaffe depended on visual sighting of targets, and cloud that obscured airfields or factories reduced the effectiveness of strikes. RAF fighters, by contrast, were increasingly relying on radar guidance that allowed them to find German formations even when visibility was poor. A radar controller might vector 3 or 4 fighters toward a contact that the pilots could not yet see, and only at the last moment would the German bombers or fighters break through the cloud layer to find British interceptors already in position and ready. This technological advantage was becoming more pronounced as August wore on, and the radar operators grew more skilled at their work. The tension in the radar stations as controllers watched blips approaching the coast and made split-second decisions about which squadrons to scramble created a parallel battle far from the actual combat. The officers in the radar stations understood that their decisions directly affected whether pilots lived or died, and that weight of responsibility never diminished no matter how many sorties they directed. The cumulative effect of the relentless waves of attacks was a kind of grinding exhaustion that affected not just individual pilots, but entire squadrons and the command structure above them. Air Chief Marshal Dowding recognized that his force was being ground down through sheer attrition, even as it won tactical victories in the air. Every day brought new losses. Every day saw pilots scrambled again and again. The replacements arriving from operational training units were becoming progressively less experienced as the need for pilots outpaced the training pipeline. A fighter pilot in peacetime might spend months undergoing advanced training before being declared combat ready. By late August 1940, the requirement for immediate bodies to fill squadron vacancies meant that pilots with only a few hours of operational training were being thrust into combat. Some of these hastily trained replacements were shot down on their first or second combat mission, barely competent to fly their aircraft, let alone engage in a deadly duel with a veteran Luftwaffe pilot. The human cost of this compressed training cycle was significant and visible in the casualty lists that grew daily. Yet, despite the mounting losses and the brutal attrition, the RAF remained unbroken. The culture of resilience that Air Chief Marshal Dowding had fostered, the sense that survival itself was victory, held firm even as the strain threatened to crack it. Pilots spoke to each other in the ready rooms of how many sorties they had flown that day, comparing experiences and offering grim humor about close calls. The camaraderie between pilots transcended the class distinctions that were still very much present in British society. Public school boys flew alongside mechanics who had been given commissions, and they depended entirely on each other for survival. The shared experience of combat created bonds that cut across all social hierarchies. Meanwhile, the ground crews who maintained the aircraft worked with almost superhuman dedication to keep fighters available. Armorer teams loaded ammunition and bombs in the dark, using only dim torchlight to avoid detection by German reconnaissance aircraft. Mechanics spent long hours tracking down mechanical problems and performing repairs that sometimes meant the difference between an aircraft being ready for the next scramble or sitting on the ground awaiting parts. The seamless coordination between pilots and ground crews represented a form of unified effort that the Germans, with their more stratified military command structure, struggled to match. The question of morale became increasingly significant as August drew toward its close. The British public, reading newspaper accounts and hearing radio reports, knew that their survival as a nation depended on these pilots in the fighters above their heads. The cultural mythology that had developed around RAF pilots, the romantic notion of the few brave young men standing between Hitler and invasion, was not entirely accurate, but it reflected a real truth that the pilots themselves understood. They were defending their homes, their families, and their country against an enemy that had already conquered most of Europe. That knowledge sustained them through sorties that should have broken any human spirit. The Luftwaffe pilots, by contrast, were increasingly uncertain about the strategic purpose of their campaign. German doctrine taught that strategic bombing was impossible, yet here they were, flying endless bombing missions that seemed to accomplish little and cost much. The best German pilots, those with the highest kill counts, were increasingly being killed or captured. The loss of experienced pilots meant that the quality of the Luftwaffe's force was beginning to decline, even as the quantity remained impressive. By late August, German pilots who had flown in the Polish campaign 2 years earlier were becoming a minority in the fighter squadrons. The factories that produced the aircraft themselves became a secondary battleground of profound importance. When the supermarine works were struck and production was disrupted, British officials faced the cold reality that if aircraft losses exceeded production capacity, the RAF would gradually be ground down to nothing. Yet the response from the British manufacturing and government sectors was to treat aircraft production as a national priority that transcended normal industrial practice. Production was dispersed to smaller facilities that could not be easily found by German reconnaissance. Workers were motivated by the knowledge that their labor directly contributed to the defense of the realm. Some factories operated around the clock, with 3 shifts of workers keeping production lines moving at all hours. Damaged aircraft were recovered from crash sites and repaired, recycling valuable materials and returning fighters to service. The competition between German bombing and British production became one of the critical factors determining whether the RAF could sustain itself. In this competition, Britain held a crucial advantage. The factories were on British soil, protected by geography, and the Germans had to fly hundreds of kilometers over hostile territory to reach them. German bombers had limited time over the target area and could carry only a fraction of the ordnance that a strategic bombing campaign would require if it were to achieve decisive results. As August transitioned into the final week before September, the intensity of the campaign reached a crescendo. The Germans, frustrated by the failure to achieve air superiority despite weeks of sustained assault, were preparing a new strategy. The constant grinding attrition of the relentless waves had tested the RAF to its absolute breaking point. Pilots were flying more than 4 sorties a day in some cases, and squadron strength was dropping below the minimum needed for effective operations. The RAF had shot down or damaged far more German aircraft than the Germans had shot down or damaged British aircraft, yet the numerical strength of the Luftwaffe remained formidable. British pilots understood that they were fighting an enemy that could sustain these losses far longer than Britain could sustain its own, yet they continued to fly, to scramble, to climb toward the German formations, knowing that each mission might be the last flight they ever took. This refusal to surrender, this absolute determination to continue fighting even when victory seemed impossible, would prove to be the decisive factor in the months and years that followed. The relentless waves of August had tested the British people and their defenders, and found them, against all odds, still standing. The summer of 1940 carried a bitter arithmetic of destruction. Every aircraft lost represented not merely a machine, but months of manufacture, thousands of individual components, and a skilled workforce stretched beyond its limits. The Luftwaffe understood this calculus as clearly as the RAF. Goering and his planners knew that victory in the air could be measured not only in dominance during daylight hours, but in the capacity of each side to replace what was lost. Germany possessed the industrial might of continental Europe at its disposal. Britain stood alone, drawing upon resources from within the island and from the dominions and allied nations across distant seas. Yet despite overwhelming numerical advantage, the Germans harbored a critical uncertainty. They did not know whether British aircraft production could sustain the losses they intended to inflict. By late August, the Luftwaffe shifted focus with deliberate intent toward aircraft factories themselves. The Supermarine Works at Southampton represented the beating heart of this strategic concern. It was here, among the machine tools and assembly lines, that the Spitfire came into being, the fighter that had surprised German pilots with its agility and climb rate was no accident of engineering genius alone. It was the product of systematic design, testing, and manufacturing coordination spanning years. The Supermarine facility stood as a symbol, and the Germans resolved to burn it from the map. On the 26th of August, German bombers struck Southampton with concentrated fury. Waves of Junkers and Heinkels descended upon the works, their bomb loads transforming precision engineering into rubble. Over 700 workers lay killed or wounded when the dust settled. The factory itself was grievously damaged, its irreplaceable machinery twisted and broken, its roof torn away to expose the grey English sky. The attack carried psychological weight beyond the physical destruction. Britain's leadership understood what the blow signified. If Supermarine could be crippled, why not the other facilities? Vickers at Weybridge, where Wellingtons were built, Rolls-Royce installations where Merlin engines were manufactured with tolerances measured in fractions of millimeters, Armstrong Whitworth, de Havilland, and the scores of subcontractors scattered across southern England who supplied components, rivets, instruments, and electrical systems. The entire machine of aircraft production was potentially vulnerable to systematic attack. The Germans pressed their advantage. Additional raids struck Southampton again and again through the late summer and into autumn. Other facilities came under bombardment. The Vickers Works at Weybridge suffered severe damage in September. Rolls-Royce factories endured repeated attacks. Each raid seemed to promise that British fighter production would grind to a halt, that the RAF would be condemned to flying a dwindling number of aircraft against an endless German tide. Yet something unexpected occurred in the rubble and ashes. Britain's industrial response to catastrophe demonstrated a resilience that German planners had not adequately anticipated. Within hours of the first supermarine attack, workers and engineers were assessing damage and planning reconstruction. Dispersal became the strategy. The RAF and the aircraft manufacturers realized that concentration of production invited concentration of destruction. The solution lay in spreading manufacturing across multiple sites. Supermarine moved production away from Southampton, distributing the assembly of Spitfire airframes across smaller factories and facilities in different regions. Component manufacturing was scattered to locations that would be harder to target, easier to defend, and less catastrophic if damaged. The famous Spitfire fuselages that once emerged in neat sequence from Southampton now came together through this dispersed network. It was less efficient in purely industrial terms. Coordination became more complex. Transportation between scattered locations consumed time and resources, yet from a strategic perspective, it was profoundly clever. A single bomber raid could no longer cripple Spitfire production. The Germans would need to maintain a campaign of destruction across dozens of targets, dissipated across the entire southern landscape. The workers themselves embodied this spirit of defiant reconstruction. When bombs fell on Supermarine in the morning, by afternoon, men and women were clearing debris, salvaging machinery, and preparing to restart operations elsewhere. The accounts from the period describe workers arriving at damaged facilities without complaint, understanding viscerally that their labor determined whether the RAF would have fighters to fly. Many lived within miles of the factories they worked in. They knew families who had been killed in the bombing. They sheltered in Anderson shelters and public shelters through the nights. They emerged in the grey dawn and walked or cycled to work anyway. The shift system transformed. 12-hour days became routine. Double shifts became the norm. Workers who might ordinarily have taken weekends worked straight through. The wage was modest by any standard, but the motivation transcended economics. These men and women understood they were manufacturing the tools of their own survival. Each Spitfire delivered to the RAF was a prayer against invasion, a physical manifestation of resistance to conquest. The supply chain itself proved notably flexible. British manufacturing had developed, over decades, a network of suppliers and subcontractors that functioned almost like an organism. If one component manufacturer was damaged, others could often expand production of the same part. Specification drawings could be duplicated and distributed. Tooling could be shared or rapidly recreated. The system possessed what might be called redundant ingenuity. When the Rolls-Royce works suffered damage in November, production of the critical Merlin engines continued at alternative facilities. Some manufacturing was moved to caves and quarries that offered protection from aerial bombardment. Engines were built in unlikely locations, then transported to assembly points. The complexity of the endeavor spiraled beyond what neat industrial calculations could encompass, yet it worked. Month after month, despite sustained German bombing, Spitfires and Hurricanes continued to emerge from British factories. The statistics tell part of the story. In August 1940, British aircraft production achieved 496 single-engine fighters. In September, the figure rose to 458. The numbers might seem modest against the scale of losses, yet they represented a trajectory. The RAF, despite losing aircraft in combat and on the ground, maintained a reserve that was not being catastrophically depleted. German losses, by contrast, proved harder to replace. The Luftwaffe suffered significant attrition of both aircraft and pilots. Replacement aircraft took weeks to manufacture and months to reach operational units. Trained pilots were even scarcer. Germany had no reserve pool of combat-ready flyers approaching the scale needed to replace losses. Every pilot killed represented an irreplaceable investment of training and experience. This asymmetry in replacement capacity became progressively more unfavorable to Germany as summer turned to autumn. The Luftwaffe was consuming its strategic depth at a rate that could not be sustained indefinitely. The British, through factories burning and workers exhausted, were somehow keeping pace. The targeting strategy itself eventually revealed its limitations. The Luftwaffe attempted to achieve victory through three approaches: destroying RAF fighters in combat, eliminating radar stations, and crippling manufacturing. The radar stations proved harder to destroy than expected, and damaged installations could often be restored within days. Aircraft destroyed in combat could be replaced by new production, but factories, once severely damaged, required weeks or months for full restoration. This should have been the Luftwaffe's path to victory. And yet, the dispersed nature of British production created a fundamental problem. No single bombing campaign could cripple the entire industrial machine. Successful raids against one facility forced the RAF to source components from another. The Germans would have needed to sustain bombing campaigns against dozens of targets simultaneously, across multiple regions, week after week without respite. The scale of effort required exceeded what the Luftwaffe could maintain while simultaneously fighting air superiority battles. The commitment to daylight bombing of factories came into direct conflict with the commitment to fighter escort coverage. The two objectives began to strain against each other. The human dimension of factory production cannot be overlooked. Women entered manufacturing roles in unprecedented numbers. Girls who had been in school months before found themselves operating precision machine tools, assembling instruments, riveting fuselages together under the direction of experienced engineers. They worked in conditions of danger and discomfort. Factory locations near major cities meant that air raid sirens could sound at any moment. Production lines would stop, workers would move to shelters, bombers would pass overhead, and then they would emerge and resume work. The psychological burden of this existence cannot be quantified in statistics. Yet the resolve remained. Letters and accounts from the period describe workers who understood they were part of something essential. This was not conscription, though much manufacturing eventually became compulsory. This was participation in the defense of their homeland through the production of weapons. The factories themselves became military installations in all but name, protected by anti-aircraft guns and barrage balloons, defended by searchlight batteries and night fighter patrols. By October, the balance of industrial capacity had shifted perceptibly in favor of Britain. German aircraft losses had mounted beyond 300, 400, 500 machines. Each represented months of German manufacturing effort. Replacement aircraft emerged from German factories, but not at the pace that losses demanded. The Luftwaffe's inventory of ready, serviceable aircraft began to decline. Pilots, that most irreplaceable asset, continued to be killed faster than training establishments could replace them. Meanwhile, British fighter production, though still modest in absolute terms, exceeded the losses that the RAF was experiencing. The gap was narrow, the margin precarious. A sudden spike in German bombing or a catastrophic air battle could still tilt the balance. But for the first time, the trajectory had turned unmistakably in Britain's favour. The factories, damaged and dispersed though they were producing faster than German bombers could destroy capacity. This was not victory, but it was the foundation upon which victory would eventually be built. Göring was beginning to realize that his promise to crush the RAF in 4 weeks would not be fulfilled. The industrial machine he had expected to cripple had proven far more resilient than his intelligence indicated. In the machine shops and assembly lines of southern England, British workers were building not merely aircraft, but the possibility of survival. The contrast between the two industrial systems became increasingly evident as summer became autumn. The Luftwaffe operated as an instrument of rapid conquest. It was designed for swift campaigns, for overwhelming force applied decisively to shattered opponents. German industrial capacity was vast, but it was organized for winning quickly, not for sustaining attrition. The RAF and British industry, by contrast, had been forced to think in terms of endurance. There was no possibility of quick victory for Britain. The nation was committed to a long struggle against odds that seemed overwhelming. The factories that produced aircraft were part of a larger industrial mobilization that transformed Britain into a fortress. Every resource, every worker, every scrap of material was directed toward a single objective: preservation and eventual victory. This meant accepting damage, accepting casualties, accepting hardship as the price of survival. It meant committing to production schedules that seemed impossible and achieving them anyway. In the spring and early summer of 1940, many observers believed Britain was defeated, that invasion was inevitable, that the only question was the terms of surrender. By autumn, something had shifted. The nation had endured. The RAF had endured. And in the factories, amid the smoke and noise and danger, British workers had ensured that the means of continued resistance continued to exist. In the final weeks of August 1940, the Royal Air Force faced not defeat in the skies, but depletion on the ground. The Luftwaffe's relentless assault had created a mathematics of attrition that threatened to overwhelm British defences, not through superior German tactics, but through the grinding, inexorable process of wearing down a finite resource. Every day, more RAF pilots were killed or wounded than could be replaced. Every day, experienced squadron leaders and promising young recruits fell from the sky, their aircraft spiraling downward, trailing smoke, leaving gaps that could not be filled quickly enough. The factories producing new fighters were keeping pace with aircraft losses, a feat in itself. But the factories producing replacement pilots moved far more slowly, and there were only so many skilled men available to fly those machines. By late August, this cruel disparity had become the central crisis of the battle, one that the Germans did not fully appreciate, and one that British commanders knew might prove insurmountable. The numbers told a story of relentless attrition. In the opening weeks of July and early August, RAF pilots were being shot down at a rate of perhaps 100 per week. This seemed sustainable, troubling but manageable. But as August progressed and the Luftwaffe intensified its operations, the weekly casualty rate climbed. By the final week of August, the RAF was losing between 200 and 300 pilots per week, killed, captured, or injured too severely to return to combat. Against this, the training pipeline delivered perhaps 50 new pilots per week, many of them hastily trained replacements with minimal operational experience. A pilot in a training program in July would not be combat-ready until September or October. The timeline was catastrophic. The trained reserve pool dwindled week by week, and the cumulative effect was beginning to show in squadron strength reports that Air Chief Marshal Dowding received with growing alarm. Numbers did not lie, and the numbers were screaming that Britain could not sustain this rate of loss indefinitely. The human cost manifested in the daily operations of every squadron. A squadron nominally comprised 26 pilots, organized into 2 flights of 12 or 13 pilots each. But by late August, most squadrons were operating at barely half strength. A squadron that should have fielded 12 fighters on a given morning might have only 6 or 7 available. The rest, either dead, injured, or simply absent, resting after flying multiple sorties the previous day. Experienced flight commanders who had survived Poland, France, and 2 months of combat over England were gone. Squadron leaders in their 30s, men who had trained a generation of younger pilots, were dead. Flight sergeants and pilot officers who had proven themselves in combat were rotated out because they could not continue without rest. But rotation out meant they were no longer in the fighting, and the squadrons left behind grew weaker. Young men of 20 and 21 years old, with only a few weeks of combat experience, were being promoted to flight leader or squadron commander positions they were not ready for, because there was simply no one else left. The gaps were not just empty chairs at the briefing table, they were erosions of capability, of morale, of the institutional knowledge that sustained operations. Fatigue became an enemy as lethal as the Luftwaffe. Pilots were flying 3, 4, or even 5 sorties per day, climbing into cramped fighter cockpits before dawn and not stopping until dusk. A single sortie might last 90 minutes of intense, adrenaline-soaked combat, twisting and turning at high altitude, blood rushing to the head, muscles burning from the G-forces of violent maneuvers. A pilot would land, debrief for 15 minutes, refuel and rearm the aircraft, grab a quick meal, and within 30 minutes the bell would ring again. Scramble, take off, climb to altitude, patrol, engage the enemy. These sequences repeated relentlessly. Sleep became a luxury rationed by mission schedules rather than need. Pilots dozed in dispersal huts between flights, smoking, playing cards with trembling hands, trying not to think about the friends who had not returned that morning. The human body and mind are not designed to sustain this for weeks without break. Concentration wavered. Reaction times, already measured in fractions of a second, degraded slightly. Young men who had been razor-sharp in early August became grey-faced and hollow-eyed by month's end, operating on muscle memory and will alone, hanging on because stopping meant admitting the fight was over. The medical establishment struggled to process the human wreckage. RAF hospitals and medical stations across southern England filled with burned pilots, pilots with legs shot away, pilots blinded by flash from exploding shells, pilots with catastrophic head injuries. Many who survived the initial wounding succumbed to infections or simply to the shock that their bodies could not overcome. The lucky ones, if a burned airman could be called lucky, were transferred to specialist burns units. New facilities opened to accommodate the volume. The psychological cost was harder to quantify, but no less real. Shell shock, though the term was not often used, was prevalent. A pilot who had ejected from his burning aircraft and parachuted into the channel, spending hours in cold water before rescue, often could not return to operations immediately. But rotation out meant removing fighting capacity from the front. Officers faced an agonizing choice: push traumatized men back into combat or accept further reduction in flying strength. Many pilots pushed themselves back into the sky before they were ready, before they had processed the trauma, driven by duty or by shame, or simply because they believed that if they did not fly, someone else would have to, and that someone else might die in their place. The human cost extended beyond the pilots themselves. Ground crew worked alongside their pilots, arming aircraft, maintaining engines, patching battle damage in the dark. They knew these men. They knew which pilot was a show-off, which one was steady, which one was terrified but hid it well. They watched aircraft take off and counted them as they returned. When a pilot did not come back, the ground crew felt it personally. These mechanics, armourers, riggers, and signals personnel were not in combat themselves. but they were not untouched by it. They bore witness to loss day after day. Their work expanded as damaged aircraft required increasingly complex repairs. Fatigue sapped them as well. And when a pilot they had served alongside did not return, they had to service the aircraft for the next pilot the next morning, had to prepare machines for men they knew were flying toward danger. The psychological weight of that knowledge was carried silently, in long hours of labor that followed fresh losses. Senior RAF commanders understood the mathematics and understood what it meant. Air Chief Marshal Dowding, the architect of British air defence, was not a man prone to pessimism, but by late August, his private assessments grew increasingly grave. In meetings with the Air Ministry and the War Cabinet, he presented the casualty figures with characteristic precision and allowed the implications to speak for themselves. If pilot losses continued at current rates, he informed them, the RAF would not have sufficient trained pilots to maintain squadrons at operational strength by late September. It was not a matter of defeat in combat, though that was possible, but of mechanical exhaustion. The RAF could be destroyed not by losing decisive battles, but by losing more men than it could replace. Other senior commanders shared his assessment. Air Vice Marshal Keith Park, who commanded 11 Group and controlled the fighters defending London and the South, was fighting the battle daily, meeting with Dowding regularly, and was acutely aware of the pilot situation. In public, both men maintained confidence and projected the determination necessary to sustain morale. In private, in locked offices with secure doors, they allowed their anxiety to show. The question that hung over every RAF headquarters was whether the pool of available pilots had been miscalculated. Before the war, British air staff had assumed that pilot training and replacement would follow certain patterns, but war did not follow assumptions. The campaigns in Norway and France had burned through trained pilots at rates not anticipated. The continuous fighting over southern England since July was consuming men at rates higher than any conflict in aviation history. The training system was attempting to expand, bringing in pilots from allied nations, Polish and Czech pilots who had fled their occupied homelands, French pilots from the armistice period, Belgian pilots, men desperate to fight and willing to die. These foreign pilots were incorporated into squadrons, often welcomed as experienced warriors, though they too were being consumed at horrifying rates. But even with these additions, the arithmetic did not work. Every effort to accelerate training, to extend flight hours for experienced instructors, to reduce training time and send pilots to operational squadrons faster, all of this narrowed the gap but did not close it. For the first time since the battle began, some officers were beginning to wonder whether resistance, no matter how stoic, could overcome the simple fact that there were only so many trained pilots in Britain and the Luftwaffe had seemingly unlimited numbers. Yet the pilots themselves continued to fly. They continued because they were soldiers and pilots, trained to obey orders and fly their aircraft. They continued because to refuse would dishonor themselves and their colleagues. They continued because the alternative, the thought of German invasion, seemed worse than almost anything. They continued because they were young, and young men often do extraordinary things, sometimes without fully understanding the cost. The pilot who flew 4 sorties on a given day did not make a philosophical decision to accept the mathematics of attrition. He simply answered the bell when it rang. He walked to his aircraft, climbed into the cockpit, started the engine, took off, flew toward the enemy, fought, and returned. He did this because that was his duty, and because the sky was being defended by other young men doing the same thing, and if he did not do his part, their sacrifice would mean less. The cumulative effect of thousands of individual decisions to continue, to fly again, to fight again, was what kept the RAF in the air through August. But even that extraordinary commitment could not overcome the mathematics forever. The question of reserves also applied to aircraft themselves. The factories were producing new fighters, but damaged aircraft that were repairable required time in the workshops. A Spitfire or Hurricane that came back to base with enemy bullet holes through the wings, with coolant leaking, with gun jams or oxygen system damage, required hours of repair work. Some aircraft could be back in the air within a day or two. Others needed weeks. The pool of immediately available aircraft for every squadron was declining, even as the factories delivered new machines. By late August, some squadrons reported having fewer serviceable aircraft than they had pilots, a reversal that should have been impossible but reflected the reality of continuous combat against an enemy that did not stop attacking. A pilot might be ready to fly, desperate to fly, but his aircraft was in the maintenance shed. The reverse situation, aircraft available but no pilot to fly them, never seemed to occur because pilots were dying faster than aircraft could be built. Air Chief Marshal Dowding also faced a strategic dilemma that compounded the pilot shortage. If the Luftwaffe concentrated its attacks on RAF fighter squadrons and airfields, the most direct attack on British fighting capacity, then sustaining enough fighters to meet them would require careful allocation of resources. But the Luftwaffe had also begun attacking aircraft factories and sector stations, facilities that were harder to defend because they were spread across southern England and required resources to protect. Dowding had to make choices about where to concentrate his limited forces. If he defended the factories, fewer fighters were available to intercept bombers. If he focused on interception, the factories remained vulnerable. The strategic balance was precarious, and any major shift in German targeting could tip it. By late August, Dowding was operating with less margin for error than he had possessed in July, and that margin was shrinking daily. Private conversations among senior RAF officers in August revealed a profound uncertainty about the outcome. These were not men who panicked easily. They had lived through the First World War, many of them as pilots themselves. They had seen what modern warfare could do, but they had also been trained in strategic calculation and logistics. And the logistics said that Britain might not have enough pilots to win this battle through its continuation at current intensity. Some officers believed that the only path to survival was if the Luftwaffe made a strategic mistake, if German command allowed the RAF to rebuild its strength by pausing the assault, or if Hitler's attention turned elsewhere and the pressure on Britain eased. Others believed that the current trajectory was unsustainable and that Britain would have to seek some kind of negotiated settlement or face invasion with an exhausted air force. A few believed that the RAF could endure if politicians and society maintained their will to resist. But by late August 1940, uncertainty was the dominant emotion in RAF headquarters, and that uncertainty stemmed not from German superiority in the air, but from the simple, terrifying possibility that Britain might not have enough pilots to sustain the defense of its own skies. In the opening days of September 1940, the Battle of Britain stood at a precarious threshold. The Luftwaffe had been hammering southern England for nearly a month, and both sides understood they were approaching a decisive moment. The RAF remained bloodied but unbowed, its fighters still rising to meet each German formation. The German High Command, however, was beginning to feel the weight of unexpected resistance. Aircraft losses mounted faster than replacement production could compensate. Pilot fatigue on both sides had reached dangerous levels, yet the strategic situation remained fluid, contested in the skies above a nation that refused to surrender. On the night of the 4th of September, a sequence of events unfolded that would fundamentally alter the course of the entire campaign. German bombers, operating under cover of darkness, were conducting raids on aircraft factories and airfields across the southeast of England. The planning for these operations was meticulous, calculated with German precision. Coordinates were marked, routes were plotted, and squadrons were briefed on their targets with the thoroughness that had become the hallmark of the Luftwaffe's operations. Yet in the confusion of night flying, amid cloud cover and the strain of long-distance navigation over unfamiliar territory, mistakes became inevitable. One formation of German bombers, perhaps disoriented by wind drift, perhaps misreading landmarks beneath the darkness, strayed from its intended course. The bombers descended through the night sky toward what their navigators believed to be an airfield or factory of military significance. What they actually found beneath them was the city of London. The bombs fell upon the East End, where warehouses, dockyards, and residential streets formed a dense fabric of urban life. The explosions that night were catastrophic in their immediacy and heartbreaking in their consequence. More than 300 people died in those first few hours. Entire blocks were reduced to rubble. The docks that lined the Thames became infernos, sending pillars of flame hundreds of feet into the sky. Fire spread with terrifying speed through neighborhoods crowded with families who had sought shelter as best they could in basements and Anderson shelters. By morning, vast sections of the East End were burning. The scale of destruction was unprecedented for Britain during this war. This was not a factory hit by accident, or a military installation caught in the crossfire of battle. This was a city neighborhood filled with civilians. The immediate impact in Berlin was one of shock and recrimination. Hitler had explicitly forbidden the bombing of London. His reasoning, made clear to his commanders weeks earlier, was simple and coldly calculated. Hitler still harbored hopes of negotiating peace with Britain once he had demonstrated German military superiority. He believed that if he showed restraint, if he did not subject British civilians to the worst horrors his air force could inflict, he might be able to reach some settlement with the British government. A terrified population might surrender, but a population subjected to deliberate terror bombing of their capital would fight with renewed determination. This was not mercy that motivated Hitler's prohibition, but rather strategic calculation. The bombing of London shattered that calculation in a single night. Hitler's rage was immediate and consuming. He summoned Hermann Göring and demanded explanations, demanded assurances that such a mistake would not occur again. Göring, already under pressure for his failure to deliver the rapid victory he had promised, found himself in an impossible position. He had assured Hitler that the RAF would be destroyed within weeks. The 4-week timeline that had seemed so confident in late July now appeared hopelessly optimistic as September progressed. Pilots were not materializing as quickly as expected. Aircraft losses were higher than anticipated, and now a navigational error had handed Hitler a justification for abandoning the restraint he had imposed. Göring attempted to explain the circumstances, but Hitler was not interested in explanation. He was interested in results, and results had failed to materialize. The British response came swiftly and with unmistakable intent. Within days, RAF Avro Lancaster bombers and other aircraft were dispatched toward Berlin. The mechanics of retaliation had a certain symmetry to it, though the strategic consequences would prove profound. RAF bombers struck the German capital, causing damage and casualties, and, perhaps more importantly for the psychological dimension, proving that Britain could strike back at the very heart of Germany. Berlin was supposed to be safe from British air power. The Luftwaffe was supposed to maintain complete dominance of the skies. Yet here were British bombers, reaching the capital, dropping their payloads on German soil. The shock and humiliation were difficult to overstate. For Hitler, the bombing of Berlin crossed a threshold he had established. The restraint he had hoped would encourage British surrender had been answered not with capitulation, but with defiance. The British had proven that they would not negotiate, would not sue for peace, would not accept German superiority even in the face of overwhelming military power. More than that, they had demonstrated their willingness to carry the war to German soil. In Hitler's mind, there was only one logical response. If negotiation was impossible, if the British would not accept dominance through demonstration of German strength, then they would be broken through terror. He issued new orders to the Luftwaffe. London was no longer to be spared. London would be targeted, along with other major British cities. The strategy would shift from military destruction to civilian terror. Hermann Göring seized upon this new directive with a certain grim relief. In a sense, it absolved him of failure. If he could not achieve air superiority through conventional military operations, he could at least deliver what Hitler now demanded, which was the destruction of British cities and the terrorization of the British population. The change in orders gave him a new mission, a new metric by which to measure success. Whether this new strategy would actually break British resistance remained an open question. But that question was no longer Göring's primary concern. He had his orders. The Luftwaffe would shift its focus from aircraft factories and airfields to the great cities of Britain. The implications of this strategic shift were counterintuitive in their consequences. By turning away from the systematic destruction of RAF fighting capacity, by abandoning the methodical campaign to overwhelm British air defences, the Luftwaffe inadvertently relieved pressure on the institution it had sought to destroy. Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding and his fighter squadrons, exhausted as they were, would now face a different kind of threat. The bombers coming at night to strike civilian targets, while horrifying in their human cost, were less focused on the destruction of British fighter strength. The respite from intensive daylight bombing operations allowed the RAF to consolidate its position, to absorb replacements, to rotate squadrons, and give tired pilots brief periods of rest. The factories producing Spitfires and Hurricanes, while still targeted, were no longer the primary objective of every German sortie. In the broader context of the campaign, this moment represented a crucial turning point. Though not in the way either side fully understood at the time, the accidental bombing of London had triggered a chain of decisions that ultimately worked against German strategic interests. By pursuing terror bombing rather than systematic military destruction, the Luftwaffe sacrificed the possibility of achieving genuine air superiority. The psychological impact on the British population was severe, but the impact on German war aims proved catastrophic. What had begun as a carefully calculated campaign to establish the prerequisites for invasion had transformed into something more desperate, more vengeful, and ultimately less likely to achieve the original objective. The night of the 4th of September 1940 marked the moment when the Battle of Britain ceased to be a purely military contest for air superiority and became something broader and more devastating. It became a struggle between a civilian population and a bombing campaign designed to break their will. It became a test of national resolve rather than a technical calculation of aircraft and pilots and radar systems. The British people would be tested in ways that the generals and air marshals had not anticipated when the summer campaign began. The Blitz would arrive with terrible force, bringing death and destruction on an unprecedented scale. Yet in abandoning his original strategy, Hitler had made a profound mistake. He had given the British people a reason to fight even harder, and he had relieved the RAF of the pressure that had threatened to break it. As September progressed and the German bombing shifted toward terror rather than precision, the entire character of the conflict transformed. The RAF transitioned from a force struggling to survive to a force that, while still heavily engaged, had begun to see a path toward endurance. The Luftwaffe, no longer pursuing systematic destruction of its opponent's fighting capacity, had paradoxically reduced its chances of achieving the overwhelming victory that Hitler demanded. One navigational error, one mistake in the darkness above an undefended city, had set in motion consequences that neither side could fully predict or control. The accident that no one intended had become the catalyst for a new and more terrible phase of the battle, one that would define the conflict in the minds of the British people for generations to come. In the early hours of the 7th of September 1940, German bombers followed the Thames toward London. They came in waves, hundreds of aircraft stretching across the darkening sky, their engines a rolling thunder that announced something fundamental had changed in the campaign. The pilots and crews who flew above the city that evening were not attempting precision strikes against fighter bases or radar stations or aircraft factories. They were coming to destroy a city. They were coming to break the will of a nation by making its people suffer. This shift in strategy, born partly from accident and partly from rage, would paradoxically save the Royal Air Force and guarantee that Britain would survive. The cause of this catastrophic pivot lay in a series of navigational errors and miscalculations that had accumulated over weeks of intense fighting. German bombers, operating under standing orders from Hitler himself, had been forbidden from striking London. The German leader held on to the possibility of negotiating peace with Britain, a hope so fragile it required this restraint. But on the 4th of September, bombers flying toward aircraft factories in the suburbs of the city became disoriented. Some accounts suggest they were evading British fighters. Others point to mechanical instruments failing to provide accurate guidance. Regardless of cause, bombs fell on London's East End. Civilians who had crowded into makeshift shelters and basements felt the earth convulse as high explosives detonated near their homes. The accidental bombing was a line crossed, though no one crossing it knew the full consequences of doing so. The British response came swiftly. Churchill, seizing the moment as a political and strategic weapon, authorized Bomber Command to strike Berlin on the night of the 11th of September. The bombers flew across German territory, navigating by starlight and approximation, and dropped their loads on the German capital. Berlin, like London, had believed itself somewhat insulated from the brutality of aerial warfare. The psychological impact in Germany was explosive. The newspapers screamed of the outrage. The German public, promised that their air force would defend the homeland, found themselves instead watching fires bloom across their own sky. And Hitler, his pride wounded far more gravely than his city, issued new orders. London and other British cities would be bombed relentlessly. The terror bombing campaign would become the new objective. Operation Sea Lion, the invasion plan itself, could wait. Revenge and the breaking of British civilian morale had become paramount. What began on the 7th of September would continue with barely a break for more than 2 months. German bombers approached London almost every night, and often during daylight hours as well. The city, which had endured its first terror bombing only weeks earlier, now became the focus of a sustained and methodical campaign of destruction. Hundreds of bombers would form up over France and the Low Countries, then stream across the Channel in formations designed to overwhelm the defences. The sound became familiar to Londoners. The distant drone that grew steadily louder, the air raid sirens that wailed like banshees through the streets, the scramble downward into shelters and underground stations and basements, anywhere that offered even the illusion of protection. Families who had lived through bombing once found themselves experiencing it night after night, their nerves shattered, their sleep interrupted, their sense of safety obliterated. The destruction was immense and often incomprehensible in scale. The Luftwaffe dropped high-explosive bombs that could level entire blocks, and incendiary bombs that started fires which spread and merged into firestorms that consumed whole neighborhoods. The docks along the Thames, vulnerable and laden with supplies and fuel, burned spectacularly. Warehouses filled with timber and food and ammunition went up in flames. The city itself, that ancient financial heart of London, was repeatedly struck and repeatedly burned. Whole streets of Georgian and Victorian architecture, some of it centuries old, collapsed into rubble within hours. Water mains ruptured, leaving firefighters unable to combat the blazes. Gas lines fractured, sending flames shooting through underground passages. It was not battle in any conventional sense. It was destruction orchestrated from the sky against people who could not fight back, who could only endure and hope and dig through the rubble looking for survivors. The human cost emerged from the smoke and ash with terrible clarity. The first night of sustained bombing killed more than 400 people in London alone. Some nights claimed 1,000 lives. The total across London over the course of the Blitz would exceed 40,000 dead, the vast majority of them civilians. Children were crushed in collapsed shelters. Families waiting out the bombing in underground stations found themselves buried when heavy bombs struck nearby. The East End bore the worst of it, the working-class neighbourhoods where the poorest Londoners lived. Factory workers and dock workers and their families, people with no access to country houses or protected country estates, suffered disproportionately. Entire families were erased from existence in an instant when a bomb found them. Orphaned children wandered through rubble looking for parents they would never find. Husbands and wives stood in the ruins of their homes, staring at the space where their life together had been, unable to comprehend the transformation wrought by a few seconds of violence from above. Yet something curious happened in the face of this catastrophe. The British people did not break. This was perhaps what Hitler and Goering had not fully comprehended. They believed that bombing could terrorize a population into surrender, that pain and loss would translate into a demand for peace at any price. And it was true that terror existed. It was true that people suffered unspeakably. It was true that London filled with refugees from neighbourhoods rendered uninhabitable, that people lost their homes and their possessions and their sense of security. But the bombing also created something unexpected. It created a kind of unity, a shared experience of suffering that paradoxically strengthened rather than weakened resolve. People who had been isolated in their own private struggles suddenly found themselves part of something larger. The Blitz became a crucible that forged British defiance rather than melted it. The psychological and strategic consequences of the shift to terror bombing worked entirely against German objectives. While bombers were dropping incendiaries on London's neighbourhoods and docks, they were no longer systematically attacking the fighter bases and aircraft factories that comprised the true target set. The RAF's airfields in southern England, which had been under constant assault, suddenly received a respite. Damaged runways could be repaired, ammunition stores could be replenished. Most critically, the aircraft factories producing Spitfires and Hurricanes continued operating without the interruption of precision bombing raids. British aircraft production, which had been precariously balanced between losses and replacement, tilted towards surplus. For the first time in weeks, RAF squadron strength began to increase rather than decline. The fighter pilots, who had been living on the edge of complete exhaustion, their nerves frayed by constant combat, found their workload shifting. Instead of desperate defensive scrambles every few hours, they flew night patrols and intercepted bomber formations that were less well defended, because fighters had to be diverted to protect bombers striking cities. The night sky over London became a new arena of combat. German bombers, coming under cover of darkness to avoid the worst of the fighter opposition, faced a RAF that was learning to fight in the dark. The technology that had saved the day for Dowding's fighters now extended into the hours of night. Radar-equipped night fighters, particularly the twin-engine Beaufighter, began hunting bombers with increasing effectiveness. Ground-based searchlights, coordinated with radar and fighter control systems, illuminated targets for night-fighting aircraft. Pilots who had never trained for night combat found themselves in the pitch black, guided by disembodied voices from the ground, following invisible radar beams toward aircraft they could not see until the last instant when a target appeared in their gun sight. German bombers, designed for daylight operations, proved vulnerable to these tactics. They could not maneuver with the precision of single-engine fighters. They could not evade as effectively in the darkness, and they began to fall with increasing frequency. The air defense of London against night bombing created a secondary problem for the German campaign. As the Luftwaffe committed more resources to night bombing and the protection of bombers against night fighters, fewer aircraft could be allocated to maintaining the pressure on other targets. The strategic dispersal of German air power meant that no single objective could be pursued with decisive force. Bombers sent to London could not simultaneously be attacking aircraft factories. Fighters assigned to protect bombers against night attack could not be engaging in the attrition campaign against RAF daylight fighters. The operation that had begun with Göring's confident promise to crush the RAF had transformed into something fundamentally different. It had become a campaign of mutual attrition, where each side imposed losses on the other, but where the mathematical advantage, slowly and almost imperceptibly, began to shift toward the British. By the end of September, the situation that had seemed so dire for the RAF in late August had transformed. The pilot shortage that had threatened to become critical was easing. Replacement pilots, trained in hastily assembled training programs and rushed through shortened courses, were arriving in squadrons in sufficient numbers to fill the gaps left by casualties. Aircraft production was keeping pace with losses. The fighter force, which in mid-August had seemed to be approaching a breaking point, had survived through sheer determination and tactical skill. The shift to bombing London, intended as a knockout blow that would end the battle and force British surrender, had instead bought the RAF time to recover. The unintended consequence of civilian terror bombing was the preservation of the fighter force that had resisted it. The strategic paradox was complete. Germany was destroying British cities and killing British citizens, but in doing so was failing to achieve the military objective that alone could have transformed this bombing campaign from an act of savagery into a successful military operation. The Blitz would continue through autumn and into winter, the bombing raids diminishing in intensity but persisting through the long, dark months. London and Coventry and Bristol and Plymouth and dozens of other cities would burn. The accumulated toll of death and destruction would shape British society for years to come. But the question that had dominated the summer of 1940 was answered. Britain would not be invaded. The RAF would not be destroyed. The German Air Force, despite its overwhelming technical advantages and numerical superiority at the start of the campaign, would be unable to achieve the mastery of the skies upon which invasion depended. And this failure, though it came at a cost in British blood and suffering that would haunt the nation for generations, meant that the war would continue. Germany would not be permitted an easy victory. The path forward would be long and destructive and uncertain, but it would be a path of continued resistance rather than capitulation. The daylight battle had cost the Luftwaffe dearly. By late September, German bombers no longer dared to operate in strength during the hours of sunlight, when RAF Spitfires and Hurricanes could rise to meet them with radar guidance and tactical advantage. But darkness brought a cruel reversal. As the sun descended over the Channel and the first stars emerged above the English countryside, the German bombers returned. They came in waves, unchallenged through the night sky, targeting cities and industrial zones with methodical precision. London burned, Coventry suffered, Southampton, Bristol, Birmingham. The list of burning cities grew longer as autumn deepened. The RAF had won the daylight battle, only to face an entirely different war after sunset. During those dark hours, the Luftwaffe possessed an enormous tactical advantage. Bombers could navigate by moonlight and starlight, dropping their payloads on cities whose defenders were rendered largely blind. Searchlights swept the sky in desperate patterns, hoping to illuminate targets that remained invisible to most observers. Anti-aircraft guns fired upward at shadows and guesses. The night belonged to the attacker, and Germany exploited that advantage with relentless bombing campaigns that would come to be called the Blitz. But the RAF would not accept defeat in darkness. The fundamental problem was one of detection and interception. Daylight fighting had been revolutionized by radar, the invisible electronic walls that warned of approaching formations and guided British fighters to intercept. Radar operated effectively in darkness as well. The electromagnetic waves cared nothing for the sun's presence or absence, but the delivery of radar information to night fighter pilots proved far more complicated than daylight operations. A pilot flying in daylight could spot enemy aircraft visually from considerable distances, especially when radar controllers guided him into the general vicinity. A pilot flying at night, surrounded by absolute darkness, could see virtually nothing without some form of illumination. The enemy appeared only when searchlights caught him, and searchlights were unreliable, controlled by separate ground crews, often failing to coordinate effectively with the fighters orbiting above. The RAF needed a different approach, a method to extend radar's protective reach through the darkness itself. The solution involved mounting radar equipment directly into fighter aircraft, allowing pilots to detect and approach German bombers without dependence on ground-based searchlights or visual contact. The technology existed in principle, but miniaturizing radar sets to fit inside fighter fuselages while maintaining sufficient power and accuracy presented formidable engineering challenges. British scientists and aircraft designers worked with urgency that bordered on obsession through the autumn months of 1940. The aircraft selected for this pioneering role was the Bristol Beaufighter, a twin-engine fighter that had been conceived in earlier years but gained new purpose during the night bombing campaign. The Beaufighter was faster than many bombers, possessed sufficient armament to inflict serious damage, and most importantly, had adequate internal space to accommodate experimental radar equipment. Ground crews began installing air interception radar sets into Beaufighter fuselages, equipment that had been hastily refined from larger ground-based systems. The radar operator sat beside the pilot, monitoring a small cathode ray tube display that showed the positions of aircraft in the darkness around them. When a target appeared on the screen, the operator guided the pilot with verbal instructions, speaking with the precision of men who understood that lives depended on clarity of communication. The radar picture showed only the nearest aircraft, creating a cone of detection that the operator could use to direct the pilot toward interception. As the gap closed and the bomber drew nearer, the radar picture became clearer, showing not just presence, but also direction and relative altitude. At some point in that final approach, the Beaufighter pilot would need to see the German bomber visually to complete the attack. The bomber might be illuminated by moonlight, or caught briefly by a searchlight beam, or distinguished by the faint exhaust glow of its engines. The moment of interception required precision and courage in equal measure. The first night kills came slowly. The radar-equipped Beaufighters took to the sky in November 1940, still using primitive equipment, still learning the peculiar choreography of night air combat. Pilots had to unlearn instincts honed in daylight flying, had to trust instruments and their radar operators absolutely, had to fly formation with aircraft they could barely see. The margin for error was slim. A pilot banking too steeply in darkness could lose spatial orientation in seconds, disorientation leading to a spin leading to a crash into the earth below. The German bombers, meanwhile, were vast, slow targets once located, lumbering through the night at speeds no faster than 150 miles per hour, unable to evade effectively once discovered. The first confirmed kills of German bombers by radar-equipped night fighters came in November, victories that proved the concept viable even with the primitive equipment available. By December, Beaufighter squadrons were claiming multiple kills per night. The psychological impact on German crews was substantial. Bombers that had operated with near impunity during darkness found themselves hunted, stalked, destroyed without warning by invisible fighters. German crews began to report encounters with unidentified aircraft, attacks that came from behind or above, attacks that erupted from total darkness. Some German pilots believed the British were using some form of secret technology, which was partially true. Others suspected searchlights were somehow being made more effective through new methods. Intelligence officers in the Luftwaffe investigated, but drew incomplete conclusions. The actual explanation, radar sets mounted inside British fighters, remained hidden until much later. The searchlight crews on the ground remained crucial even as radar-equipped night fighters entered service. Searchlights could illuminate bombers for the benefit of the Beaufighters, and when a searchlight caught a German bomber, the contrast between the brilliant cone of light and the darkness beyond was so stark that pilots could see their targets clearly from considerable distances. The best night fighting operations involved a coordinated effort, ground-based radar detecting the bombers and vectoring the Beaufighters toward them, Beaufighter radar operators fine-tuning the approach, and searchlight crews providing illumination for the final visual identification and attack. This system developed gradually through trial and error, through cooperation between fighter squadrons, searchlight units, and radar stations. Communications networks were improved and refined. Procedures were established, practiced, and modified based on operational experience. Each night brought learning. Each night revealed new complications and required new solutions. The RAF's capacity for adaptation, for working across service boundaries and sharing information quickly, proved superior to the Luftwaffe's more rigid command structure. German bomber crews faced an enemy that learned and evolved with each passing week, that developed new tactics faster than countermeasures could be developed against them. Weather played a significant role in the effectiveness of night fighter operations. On nights when cloud cover was thick, searchlights could not reach through the clouds to illuminate targets, and radar-equipped night fighters could not achieve visual contact even when they had detected the bombers on their radar screens. The German bombers, using radio navigation aids that were crude but functional, could often locate their targets despite the clouds and complete darkness. During bad weather nights, the bombing campaign continued with little interference, and the Luftwaffe inflicted serious damage. But on clear nights, with good visibility and moonlight, the balance tilted sharply toward the defenders. German bomber losses on clear nights increased steadily through the autumn and winter, reaching levels that deeply concerned Luftwaffe commanders. The weather, that most unpredictable variable, became a factor in the battle's outcome. On clear nights, the RAF shot down bombers. On cloudy nights, the bombing continued. Neither side could control the weather, but both understood its profound impact on the evening's outcome. The introduction of radar-equipped night fighters represented a crucial turning point in the battle's later phases. The massive daylight bombing campaign had failed to destroy the RAF's daylight fighter force or its supporting infrastructure. The Luftwaffe had hoped to shift to night bombing and thereby eliminate the RAF's ability to resist. But British technology and ingenuity extended the battle into darkness, transformed night operations from a sanctuary for bombers into another arena of deadly combat. German planners had grossly underestimated British scientific capacity and the speed with which new technologies could be developed and deployed operationally. They had assumed radar was a specialized system useful for ground-based air defense, but had not imagined it could be miniaturized and installed in fighters. This assumption proved catastrophic to German strategy. The night bombing campaign, which had promised to break British will and destroy fighting capability, instead became another arena where the RAF demonstrated resilience and innovation. Civilian casualties remained terrible. The damage to cities remained extensive, but the attrition of German bombers continued at unsustainable rates. The RAF had found a way to extend its defense through the darkness itself. The Beaufighter pilots who flew these night missions operated under conditions of extraordinary difficulty. They could not see each other, could barely see the bombers even when close, could not always distinguish friend from foe in the darkness. The radar operators, hunched over their small screens, bore a different but equally substantial burden, translating electronic signals into verbal guidance that had to be clear and precise at all times. Mistakes could result in friendly fire incidents or in the Beaufighters being unable to locate their targets despite successful radar contact. Yet pilots and operators worked together with professionalism and determination, learning the rhythms of night combat, developing individual styles and procedures that worked for their particular partnerships. Some crews became exceptionally proficient, claiming multiple kills across successive nights. Their names entered RAF records and eventually became known throughout British aviation circles. They represented a new breed of fighter pilot, one who fought by instrument and radar guidance rather than visual dogfighting. The old traditions of aerial combat, the banking and turning and jockeying for position in view of the enemy, meant little in darkness. Night fighting required different skills, different courage, different kind of professionalism. The ground defense infrastructure supporting night fighter operations deserved recognition equal to the pilots and aircraft themselves. Radar operators at ground stations worked continuously, tracking German bomber formations, providing early warning and vector information to night fighter squadrons. Anti-aircraft crews improved their own accuracy through practice and experience, though hitting aircraft at night with gunfire remained extraordinarily difficult. Searchlight operators, often working with little training and basic equipment, nonetheless contributed meaningfully to bomber interceptions. The entire system functioned as an integrated network rather than separate components. When one element failed or functioned poorly, the system's effectiveness declined noticeably. When all elements worked in coordination, the results could be devastating to German raiders. This integrated approach to air defense, combining detection technology, night fighter aircraft, anti-aircraft guns, and searchlights into a coherent system, represented sophisticated military thinking by the RAF and its supporting services. It demonstrated that winning air battles required far more than simply building fast aircraft and recruiting brave pilots. It required coordination, communication, training, and the capacity to rapidly adapt technology to operational requirements. By the time winter descended fully on England, the night bombing campaign had become far more costly for Germany than anyone in the Luftwaffe High Command had anticipated. The combination of radar-equipped night fighters, improving anti-aircraft defenses, and night fighter tactics that were becoming increasingly effective had steadily reduced the German bombers' ability to operate without interference. The losses were not catastrophic, but they were steady, consistent, and unacceptable to commanders who had expected night bombing to provide respite from RAF pressure. Instead, German crews found themselves hunted in darkness, attacked from angles they could not anticipate, sometimes shot down without any warning until the instant their aircraft caught fire. The night sky, which had seemed like sanctuary in September, had become a battlefield where German superiority existed only on paper. The actual situation in the darkness was far different from what commanders had expected. The RAF had transformed the night into another arena of combat, another opportunity to resist, another chance to inflict damage on the enemy. The Luftwaffe's second major strategic gambit, night bombing to break British resolve, was following the same pattern as the first. Initial German confidence giving way to recognition that the British opponent possessed resources, ingenuity, and determination beyond what had been anticipated. The battle was far from over, but the trajectory was becoming clearer. The broader significance of the night fighting campaign lay in its demonstration that military dominance could not be assumed on the basis of raw numbers alone. Germany possessed more bombers, more trained crews, and more firepower than the RAF's defensive fighters could theoretically absorb. But theory and practice diverged sharply. British deployment of radar, development of night fighting tactics, and the industrial capacity to build replacement aircraft kept pace with attrition. The Germans, expecting swift and decisive victory, found themselves engaged in a war of attrition that they were not equipped to win. The night bombing campaign would continue for months, inflicting serious damage on British cities and killing thousands of civilians, but it would not achieve the strategic objective of forcing Britain's surrender or neutralizing its military capacity. Instead, it would become one of history's great examples of how tactical innovation and technological adaptation could extend and ultimately alter the course of a campaign. The RAF had come to understand something crucial about modern warfare, that victory required not just courage and aircraft, but vision, adaptation, and the integration of technology into tactics in ways that the enemy had not anticipated. As winter deepened and the Blitz continued through the darkness, that lesson was being written in the night sky above England, in letters of fire and electronic signals that would echo through military thinking for generations to come. By the middle of September, something had shifted in the calculus of the battle. The momentum that had carried the Luftwaffe through August, that sense of inevitable progress toward dominance, had begun to fragment. The accounting was becoming impossible to deny. German bomber squadrons that had launched attacks with confidence a month earlier were returning with gaps in their formations that could not be easily filled. Aircraft mechanics worked through the night, attempting repairs on damaged machines. Yet the rate of attrition far exceeded the rate of replacement. Pilots who had survived dozens of sorties were being lost with no trained successors available to take their places. The Luftwaffe had not yet suffered a catastrophic defeat, but it had begun to bleed in ways that mathematics could not conceal. The numbers told a story that German high command could no longer ignore. By mid-September, the Luftwaffe had sustained losses totaling approximately 1,500 aircraft, destroyed or damaged beyond any reasonable prospect of repair. These were not trivial figures representing equipment that could be replaced through production increases. These were irreplaceable machines that had required months to build, highly trained crews that had required years to develop, and organizational capacity that had been stretched to its absolute limit through the summer's relentless campaign. For every German bomber that fell, a factory had to produce another. For every pilot killed, a replacement had to be trained in combat operations, a process that could not be accelerated no matter how desperate the circumstances became. The pool of experienced pilots was finite, and each loss made the remaining force progressively weaker. The strategic situation had evolved into something that confronted German commanders with an unwelcome truth. The Royal Air Force, despite its own substantial losses, had proven itself capable of replacement at a rate that the Luftwaffe simply could not match. British aircraft factories, despite the bombing campaign specifically designed to cripple them, had continued producing Spitfires and Hurricanes in numbers that sometimes actually exceeded losses. British pilot training programs, though strained, had kept reinforcements flowing to squadrons even as experienced pilots fell. The Germans had assumed that the British aircraft industry would crumble under sustained bombardment, that the RAF would exhaust its trained pilot pool and collapse into organizational chaos. None of these assumptions had proven correct. Instead, the RAF had bent but not broken, had suffered grievously but not fatally, and had maintained operational capability even as German strength visibly declined. The question of fighter escorts had become the central dilemma consuming the attention of Luftwaffe commanders. The bombers could not penetrate British airspace without fighters to protect them from RAF interception. Yet these fighters, primarily the Messerschmitt Bf 109, were themselves limited in their range and operational radius. A fighter could fly perhaps 300 kilometers from its home base and maintain combat capability before fuel concerns forced a return. This inherent limitation meant that as German bombers ranged deeper into England, attacking targets inland, their fighter escort had to be proportionally larger and more numerous to provide adequate protection. A strike against an airfield near Manchester or an industrial facility in the Midlands required fighter formations so large that they consumed resources desperately needed for other operations. The mathematics of escort duty was compressing Germany's options by the week. What had seemed strategically rational in early August had become logistically impossible by mid-September. The Luftwaffe's original concept for the air campaign had assumed rapid achievement of air superiority through waves of bombers escorted by fighters. Once air dominance was achieved, bombers could range freely across Britain, striking targets with impunity. This had never happened. The RAF had instead proven stubborn and effective, refusing to be drawn into the large-scale decisive air battles that Goering had envisioned. RAF fighters appeared when they would appear, engaged when conditions favored them, and withdrew when necessary, husbanding their strength against the German numerical advantage. The strategic situation demanded either the achievement of superiority through overwhelming force or the acceptance of a stalemate. Germany was rapidly approaching the conclusion that overwhelming force was simply not available. German commanders began to recognize a harsh reality that contradicted their earlier confidence. The Luftwaffe did not possess the capacity to simultaneously maintain day-bombing operations against distant targets, provide adequate fighter escort, replace losses from all causes, and prepare for potential operations against other strategic objectives. Something had to give. The very premise of Operation Sea Lion, which had required the Luftwaffe to achieve decisive air superiority in order to enable the amphibious invasion of Britain, was becoming strategically unrealistic. Invasion planning had assumed that once air superiority was achieved, German fighter strength would be sufficient to provide air cover for transport ships and invasion forces. But if fighter strength was being consumed in endless escort duty for bombers, then the force available for invasion support would be dangerously weak. The circular logic of the operation was beginning to consume itself. The human dimension of the attrition was perhaps even more significant than the mechanical losses. Pilots who had entered the campaign in July had endured more than 2 months of continuous combat operations, often flying 3 or 4 sorties in a single day. Fatigue was accumulating in ways that affected judgment, reaction time, and overall combat effectiveness. Experienced pilots, the men who had survived the Polish campaign and the French campaign, and who had learned hard lessons about combat aviation, were being lost at an accelerating rate. Training new pilots was not simply a matter of technical instruction in aircraft handling. Modern fighter combat required experience gained only through exposure to actual combat conditions. A pilot with 100 hours of flight time but no combat experience would face a veteran of 50 aerial combats who had learned through survival how to maneuver, how to manage fuel, how to recognize danger. The Luftwaffe was systematically losing its experienced pilots while being forced to commit increasingly green replacements to replace them. The RAF, despite its own pilot exhaustion and the severe strain on experienced personnel, had begun to benefit from a crucial advantage in pilot replacement policy. German pilots who were shot down and captured, if they survived the crash, became prisoners of war. British pilots who were shot down could be recovered if they ejected over home territory. A British pilot who bailed out over Kent could, if fortunate, return to his squadron within days. A German pilot shot down over Kent was lost to the Luftwaffe for the remainder of the war. This simple geographic reality meant that every time a German pilot was killed, the Luftwaffe lost not just a man, but a trained asset that could not be replaced. Every time a British pilot was killed, the nation had lost a man, but not necessarily the trained capability he represented, as other pilots continued serving. This disparity had not been apparent in early August, but by mid-September it had accumulated into a strategic advantage of growing significance. The psychological dimensions of the battle had also begun to turn against Germany. German pilots, who had entered the campaign with confidence bordering on arrogance, had gradually come to understand that the British were not going to collapse. Each mission had seemed, in early August, to bring inevitable German victory closer. By mid-September, each mission had begun to seem pointless, a repetition of the previous day's efforts without apparent progress toward the stated objective. Pilot morale, while not yet broken, had fractured. Men spoke privately of the endless stream of Spitfires that seemed to regenerate no matter how many were shot down. Intelligence officers noticed growing pessimism in squadron debriefings. Orders from high command demanding renewed efforts for victory in 4 weeks, in August, had given way to orders demanding continued attacks, despite obvious deterioration in conditions. Momentum had shifted from offense to defense, from confidence to doubt, from the expectation of victory to the acceptance of stalemate. By mid-September, the German Air Force faced a situation that had no favorable resolution. To continue the bombing campaign at its current intensity would require even greater losses that could not be sustained indefinitely. To abandon the bombing campaign would represent an admission that Operation Sea Lion was impossible. To reduce the intensity of bombing while maintaining it at some level was to accept a prolonged stalemate in which British strength could only recover while German strength could only decline. There was no option available that preserved the original German objective of decisive victory and invasion. The Luftwaffe leadership began the difficult process of accepting that the fundamental premise of the campaign had become impossible to achieve. The pride of the German Air Force, which had dominated European skies through the spring and summer, was confronting the reality of its own limitations. The strategic picture became increasingly grim as the second week of September advanced. German intelligence assessments, which had previously emphasized the imminence of British collapse, began to acknowledge the possibility that the RAF would continue functioning at meaningful strength despite months of intensive attack. Reports from reconnaissance aircraft and from captured pilots under interrogation all suggested that British aircraft production had not suffered the catastrophic decline that bombing was supposed to inflict. British pilot losses had been severe, but British pilot training programs had apparently managed to produce replacements faster than pre-war assessments had estimated possible. The radar stations that had been damaged during the campaign had either been repaired or replaced with emergency equipment that restored function. Every aspect of British defence that bombing was supposed to destroy either regenerated or proved more resilient than German planners had assumed. Goering was receiving increasingly somber assessments from his commanders regarding the feasibility of achieving air superiority. The confident predictions of early August, when he had promised Hitler that the RAF would be defeated within 4 weeks, had become embarrassingly inaccurate. The 4 weeks had elapsed. The RAF had not been defeated. Instead, German losses continued climbing, pilot morale continued eroding, and British strength continued proving more durable than expected. The Hermann, as Goering was known to his subordinates, faced a choice between acknowledging reality or demanding ever greater efforts in pursuit of an objective that was becoming transparently unachievable. The pressure on him from Hitler's headquarters increased daily. Explanations were demanded. Excuses were rejected. The promise that had been so confidently made in early August now hung over the Luftwaffe leadership like an executioner's blade. The turn of the tide, which historians would later identify as occurring during this middle period of September, was not marked by any single dramatic event or catastrophic German defeat. There was no moment where the Luftwaffe suddenly ceased operations or admitted defeat. Rather, the shift was one of accumulated losses, mathematical exhaustion, and the gradual recognition by German commanders that they faced a problem without a solution. The Luftwaffe would continue operations through autumn and winter, would continue inflicting damage on British targets, would continue killing British civilians and destroying British infrastructure. But the strategic objective of achieving air superiority sufficient to enable Operation Sea Lion had become impossible. Germany would not be invading Britain. The question that now faced German high command was what would be done with an air force that had failed in its primary mission, and that was increasingly being needed for operations against other enemies in other theatres of war. By the middle of September, the mathematics of air warfare had begun to turn against Germany in ways that Hermann Göring could no longer deny. The Luftwaffe had lost approximately 1,500 aircraft since the opening of sustained operations in August, a figure that shattered the calculations upon which the entire campaign had been premised. These were not merely machines, they were irreplaceable repositories of engineering skill, industrial capacity, and months of production. More critically, they represented the death of experienced pilots whose training could not be rushed, whose instincts could not be manufactured in any factory, whose absence at the controls of remaining fighters meant a degradation of German fighting effectiveness that compound mathematics made only worse with each passing day. The Reich possessed no infinite reserve of either aircraft or aviators, and Goering had promised Hitler both air superiority and invasion within a time frame that had already slipped beyond credibility. The man who had sworn to crush the Royal Air Force in 4 weeks now faced the humbling reality that after more than 6 weeks of relentless assault, the British were not only still flying, but flying with increasing effectiveness. The situation that confronted Goering in mid-September was one of strategic dissonance between means and ends. German bombers had struck with surprising consistency, setting fires across southern English airfields and damaging factories that built the Spitfires, which had become the Luftwaffe's most persistent nemesis. Yet somehow, impossibly, the RAF kept rising to meet them. Aircraft that intelligence reports claimed should have been destroyed remained operational. Pilots who ought to have been demoralized fought with undiminished ferocity. The radar stations that German intelligence had largely failed to recognize as critical targets continued transmitting their warnings, allowing British fighters to scramble into position before German bombers ever crossed the coast. What should have been a campaign of attrition favoring Germany had reversed itself through a combination of British technical innovation, manufacturing resilience, and pilot determination that Goering's planning had fundamentally underestimated. The Reichsmarschall began to comprehend that his adversary was not the brittle, exhausted opponent he had been assured would crack under sustained pressure. Inside the headquarters of the Luftwaffe, strategic reassessment commenced with the careful precision of men confronting failure. Goering convened conferences with his field commanders, senior staff officers, and technical specialists who brought him the accounting that German high command could no longer avoid. The numbers were brutal in their clarity. Fighter escorts required for the protection of bombers now consumed fuel and pilot resources at rates that stretched available supplies. Long-range bomber formations deep into British territory had become nearly impossible to sustain without prohibitive losses. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighters, superior in certain dimensions and favoured by the most aggressive German pilots, lacked the fuel capacity for extended operations over British territory, forcing them to turn back before bomber formations reached targets, leaving the bombers vulnerable during their deepest penetrations and during withdrawal. Meanwhile, the British had somehow manufactured sufficient Spitfires to maintain squadron strength despite their own losses, a production capability that German intelligence had underestimated by factors that now seemed almost criminal in their miscalculation. The possibility that Germany might not achieve air superiority began to infiltrate Goering's strategic thinking, not as speculation, but as probability. What made this realization particularly painful for Goering was the contrast between his promises and his performance. In his capacity as Reichsmarschall, he stood as Hitler's supreme military subordinate and had staked his credibility on absolute conviction that the Luftwaffe would deliver what the army could not. He had spoken with the kind of certainty that brooked no doubt, that dismissed concerns from subordinates who urged caution, that assured the Führer that German air power would pulverize British resistance. Now, facing the evidence that his projections had been fundamentally flawed, Goering confronted not merely a military setback, but a political catastrophe. Hitler did not tolerate failure in his subordinates, and the Führer's attention to the Battle of Britain had been absolute up to this point, with regular briefings and mounting impatience evident in his comments. Goering recognized that his standing depended on finding a way to reframe the campaign in terms that preserved his authority while acknowledging military reality, a calculation that required both honesty and considerable artistry in the presentation of facts. The strategic shift that Goering authorized in mid-September reflected this dilemma with remarkable clarity. Rather than continuing to attempt the destruction of the RAF as a fighting force through concentrated assaults on airfields and aircraft production, Goering progressively reoriented the Luftwaffe toward what he termed an attrition warfare strategy, focused increasingly on night bombing of British cities. This approach appeared to offer several advantages from Goering's perspective, though none of them addressed the fundamental impossibility of achieving air superiority. Night bombing reduced vulnerability to RAF fighters operating in daylight, where British advantages in radar guidance and fighter agility proved most devastating. It allowed the Luftwaffe to continue offensive operations without the staggering loss rates that daytime raids incurred. It shifted the focus of German operations toward a new target category, civilian infrastructure and population centers, that ostensibly served German strategic objectives by undermining British will to continue the war. What Goering did not articulate, though his field commanders understood it perfectly well, was that this shift amounted to a strategic retreat disguised as a change in operational emphasis. The changes manifested in concrete alterations to German bombing patterns and fighter deployment. Larger fighter formations